Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now beginning. Story 1. The Great Wind of Lincolnshire, England, 1341. It begins with a leaf, not a storm. The leaf, browned and curling at the edges, drifted down from a pollarded ash tree in the outer field beyond the priory walls. The monks of Barling's Abbey in Lincolnshire took little notice. September had arrived, and with it came the sharp scent of dying foliage and the slow rot of reeds near the Witham River. But something else was coming, too. Something older than Scripture, and less understood than the Latin they translated. The setting, a quiet year, a quiet monastery. 1341 was an unusually still year. The Black Death had not yet struck, though rumors of illness in the ports of Genoa drifted northward with anxious caravans. England, under the rule of Edward III, was entangled in political grievances, but the countryside of Lincolnshire remained its usual sleepy sprawl of thatch-roofed dwellings, Roman road remnants, and clerical labor. Barling's Abbey, a modest Premonstratensian institution, was more noted for its sheep farming than theological innovation. Its monks lived simply, prayed rhythmically, and wrote infrequently. The monastery's annals, Barling census, a yearly record of weather, harvest, and divine signs, had little of note for 1341, until the entry marked Septima Calendas Octobers, the seventh day before the Kalends of October, September 25th. A description unlike others. The Latin entry, copied by Brother Tullis, begins as such: Ventus orabilis surrexit ab occident, et terra tremuit sub ictu ius. Non erat pluvia nec tonitrium, tantum ventus est ventus qui loquibatur mort. A horrible wind arose from the west, and the ground trembled under its strike. There was no rain nor thunder, only wind, but wind that spoke of death. To modern ears, it might sound poetic, but medieval chroniclers rarely indulged in metaphor, especially not monks like Tullis, whose normal writing tone ranged between damp sheep complaints and harvest dullness. For him to describe the wind as speaking death was out of character and significant. The record continues. Barns were torn open, thatched homes unroofed, a child missing, and curiously no lightning, no rain, no thunderclaps, just wind that moved like a beast on legs. What could it have been? To us, the evidence suggests a localized tornado or tornadic microburst, but such terminology did not exist in 14th century England. The word tornado itself wouldn't enter English until the late 16th century, borrowed from Spanish sailors, and likely from the Latin tonare, to thunder. Instead, such events were interpreted through theological or symbolic lenses. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, some centuries earlier, had once described a storm as a dragon flying through the air. The framing was always metaphorical, but not imaginative. These were attempts to describe the indescribable with the tools at hand. But there's a curious consistency to these winds. Surviving accounts, more than just Barling's. Another monastic record, this one from Kirkstead Abbey, roughly 15 miles to the south, also noted a tearing wind without water on the same day. Meanwhile, layman records, such as a court roll from nearby Horncastle, mention a delayed manorial court due to roofless halls and frightened tenants. This aligns with a curious but sparsely documented period of severe wind events in England during the 1340s, years before the Great Pestilence, but marked by environmental irregularities. Frosts in May, hail in July, windstorms without lightning. Could climate have played a role? Possibly. The Little Ice Age, a loosely defined period of global cooling between 1300 and 1850, was already showing signs of stress on agriculture. Cooler air masses clashing over warmer land could produce turbulent weather patterns, even tornadic activity. But to a monk in Barling's, such explanation would have seemed not just alien but irreverent. The theology of wind. In monastic understanding, winds came from God's breath, angels' wings, or Satan's fury. The book of Job references the house of Job's sons being destroyed by a great wind from the wilderness, a passage often cited in medieval sermons as a reminder of divine judgment. Brother Tullis, perhaps steeped in this ideology, wrote in a margin note beside the main entry, Cetera mugit, est enim vox Domini. If the earth groans, it is the voice of the Lord. Yet he also added another phrase below strikingly out of place. Aut forsitan non est Domini. Or perhaps it is not the Lord. This second sentence, hesitant, fearful, possibly heretical, was scratched out in later ink, but it speaks to a moment of doubt, of questioning. If the wind was not from God, what then? Aftermath, structural ruin, social stillness. What followed the great wind of Lincolnshire in 1341 was not revolution, not famine, but a quiet reconstruction. Roofs were rebuilt. The lost child was never found. Crops, though trampled, were salvaged. And within weeks, daily life resumed. That is perhaps the most enduring theme of medieval rural England. Resilience through resignation. Not stoicism, exactly, but an ingrained sense that nature, whether divine or malevolent, was to be endured, not explained. Barling's Abbey continued for another 200 years before being dissolved under Henry VIII. By the time of its dismantling in 1537, its walls had weathered more storms, some meteorological, others political. But the story of that one wind, in 1341, lives on only in ink, and a question scratched out by a monk too uncertain to leave it legible. And so we are left with a question. If the monks of Lincolnshire could not explain the wind they witnessed, nor were they allowed to, how many other such winds went unrecorded, misattributed, or simply forgotten? The wind came, tore through, and left. That much is known. But the fragments it left behind, disjointed records, local gossip turned oral memory, and marginalia inked into forgotten scrolls, suggest something else. A network of reactions, adaptations, and most surprisingly, questions that outlasted the storm. If Section 1 told us how a monastery recorded a terrible wind, Section 2 turns outward toward villages, lords, courts, and ordinary lives, tracing the tendrils of an unexplained event as they quietly spread through Lincolnshire. Parish registers, sparse yet telling. Parish registers, as we know them today, weren't systematically kept until after the 1538 edict by Thomas Cromwell. But certain parishes in England, especially those connected to wealthy manors, kept earlier, less formal records. Accounting ledgers, alms rolls, and land disputes occasionally scrawled on recycled vellum. In the hamlet of Langton by Ragby, roughly 10 miles northeast of Barlings, a peculiar entry was noted by the reeve in a manorial rent roll dated October 1341. 2 cottages rendered unfit for tenure by act of wind, tenancy suspended, hearth tax delayed by decree of Sir William. This was no mystical interpretation. It was economic recognition. The wind made property untenable, therefore rent obligations were paused. That was rare. In 14th century England, rent was expected regardless of flood, fire, or famine. The fact that Sir William, likely Sir William de Willoughby, the local lord, formally acknowledged storm damage in a legal document, suggests that what happened in late September 1340 was not an isolated gust. Rather, it had a radius and a cost. Agricultural disruption. Further west in Stowe, a village with a long ecclesiastical heritage, a tithe record noted bundled wheat lost to sky. What this meant exactly is unclear, but local tradition held that the village's harvest carts, left overnight before their trip to the priory storehouse, were found upturned and half-emptied, yet with no footprints in the soft mud surrounding them. Such stories sound supernatural to the modern reader, but they reflect a genuine confusion. Rural folk knew wind, but not wind like this. No thunder, no rain, no storm cloud, just motion, sudden, fast, and gone. A kind of theft by nature. In total, records from 5 nearby parishes including Bomber, Minting, Fiskerton, and Ragby suggest that between September 25 and 27, unusual weather disrupted grain collection, shepherding routines, and construction work. These events were small, scattered, and mostly recorded not for posterity but for tax purposes. Yet when pieced together, they resemble a map of wind damage, likely caused by a linear, fast-moving weather front or even a chain of small tornadic events. Language struggles when there were no words. One of the most telling aspects of the 1341 wind event is how people tried to describe it. The word wind, from Old English wind, related to Old Norse vindr, was familiar, but not in this context. In lay records we see strange phrases. Sky-fingered, spinning hurt, devil's rope, the god breath sudden, sky-hooked. None of these are standard descriptions for common gales or tempests. Instead, they feel reaching, as though trying to name something seen once without precedent. A family account from Nettleham, kept by a literate weaver named Henry LeWebb, mentions, "My sister was struck by a door from God's kick. She lives. The cow was taken. We did not hear it leave." Again, there's confusion. Things disappeared or moved without the usual storm sounds. Cows vanished. Fences flattened in straight lines. Chimneys collapsed in ways inconsistent with lateral wind. One thing is clear, people knew ordinary wind. This was not that. Clerical caution. Back in Barling's Abbey, the aftermath of the wind triggered more than physical repair, it led to theological self-correction. The marginalia in Brother Tullis's entry, the one where he questioned whether the wind was divine, was not only scratched out, but replaced in a visibly different hand. Ventus erat signum, non est quaer est credier. The wind was a sign. It is not for questioning but for believing. This reflects the doctrinal tightrope walked by monks in the 14th century. Though many were scholars, particularly in the Benedictine and Premonstratensian orders, they were not immune to the ecclesiastical pressure to frame all events through divine will. And the 1340s were an anxious decade. The 100 Years' War had begun in 1337. Famine and crop failures haunted the early 1330s, and the Black Death was, unbeknownst to England, only a few years away. In this climate, unusual events like a dry, spiraling wind were rarely interpreted as natural accidents. They were warnings, judgments, or portents. The absence of myth. Interestingly, despite the mystique surrounding the event, no lasting legend or myth emerged in the region. There is no wind of Lincolnshire folklore, no poetic ballads, no saintly interventions recorded. Why? Likely because the event was too ambiguous. It lacked the visual theatrics of fire or flood. No saints appeared. No miraculous survival stories circulated. No kings took note. It was, in the words of a 15th century copyist, but a wind. Its invisibility condemned it to fragmented records, half-mentions, and interpretative erasure. And yet, the impact is quietly tangible in construction records that note strengthened beams post-storm, or revised field arrangements that avoid previously exposed clearings. In this sense, the storm may not have changed culture, but it changed habit. It taught caution, adaptation, and perhaps most tellingly, silence. Modern interpretations: could this have been a tornado? From a meteorological standpoint, much of Lincolnshire sits on flat fenland, once marshy and now cultivated. Its open terrain, combined with transitional climate zones, makes it a potential, albeit rare, candidate for tornadic activity. Today, tornadoes do occur in the UK, though usually small, EF0, EF1 on the enhanced Fujita scale. Notably, The 1091 London tornado, possibly an EF2, destroyed part of London Bridge. The 1981 nationwide outbreak remains the largest tornado event in European history. So while Britain is not a tornado hotspot, it's not immune, and the 14th century climate anomalies due in part to volcanic activity and shifting jet streams could have made such events more likely. The absence of formal terminology in 1341 meant that what may have been a tornadic burst was instead remembered as a confusing, dry, destructive wind. But its structure-fast onset, narrow path, rotational damage, sudden disappearance closely mimics modern descriptions of small tornadoes. Fragmented memory, collective impact. By winter, the wind of September 1341 was already fading from written record. Its traces economic, physical, linguistic would continue, but indirectly. The barns rebuilt were made with better joinery. The grain carts were stored farther from open fields. The monks, though, who once questioned the divine source of wind chose not to again. And so we ask, if even an unexplained wind could alter construction, theology, and tenancy, how many changes in history have begun with nothing more than an invisible force? In the years following 1341, no one in Lincolnshire wrote directly about the wind again. No sermons preserved it. No chronicler expanded upon it. No bard sang of it in the mead halls. And yet the traces it left behind were unmistakable not in ink, but in decisions, habits, and the slow reshaping of the land. As we conclude this story, we will look not just at the aftermath in buildings or weather, but in the long-term social memory or lack thereof, and the subtle but powerful role these silent, unexplained forces played in shaping both medieval life and modern interpretations. The years after, a curious omission. If we examine the Barlings Abbey annals for the decade following 1341, the entries remain dull, predictably so. 1342, modest barley, sheep birth low. 1343, rain in Pentecost, roof mended. 1344, no tithe from Farthingwell due to sickness. Yet nowhere is the wind mentioned again. This silence is not accidental, it reflects a broader pattern in medieval records. When an event could not be theologically explained or morally classified, it was either reframed as divine punishment or ignored entirely. Compare this with how earthquakes were treated. A tremor in 1318 in northern England, though minor, led to weeks of penitential processions. But wind was too shapeless, too fast, too ungraspable. And in a society that found comfort in cosmic order, things that defied classification were not feared most, but simply forgotten. Architecture adapts quietly. However, stone does not forget. In architectural surveys of Lincolnshire priories and farmsteads from the 14th century onward, we see a slow shift in design. Roof angles steepened in new constructions after 1341. Wooden joinery methods became more interlocked, particularly in barns. Some church towers built in the 1350s included wind-slotted openings, thought by some scholars to be adaptations to sudden gusts. These may not be dramatic changes, but they are indicative of a community adapting to a remembered threat without numbing it. When you walk through the ruins of Barlings Abbey today, its once proud arches now exposed to sky, you can imagine those repairs, the nervous measurements, the uncertain masons trying to build not against rain or cold, but against the unknowable. Stories told without being written. So how was the wind remembered? Likely not in chronicles, but around hearth fires, in midwives' warnings, and through cautionary habits passed down by grandparents. One oral tradition, noted by 19th century folklorist William P. Greenwell, recounts a superstition from Lincolnshire. Do not leave bread on a window ledge before Michaelmas, or the devil will lift it with the wind. This sounds like superstition, and it is. But superstition often grows in the cracks where historical memory fails. Greenwell, unaware of the 1341 storm, dismissed it as a silly saying. But if that year saw carts overturned, food lost to sudden gusts, and unexplained damage, perhaps the devil, as ever, stood in for the unknown. There is no devil in the records of Barlings, but he may live in the silence. Why this wind mattered. At face value, the 1341 wind was not a major historical event. It caused no war. It crowned no monarch. It sparked no doctrinal schism. But it reveals something more nuanced and arguably more valuable. How societies respond to rare, ambiguous threats. How information is passed or suppressed when it challenges orthodoxy. How resilience often comes not from heroism, but from quiet, dull adjustments. The people of Lincolnshire didn't need to invent gods or write epics. They rebuilt barns. They moved carts. They watched the sky with a bit more suspicion. And when the wind didn't return, they folded their fears into habit, not legend. A final echo, the rediscovery of a margin. In the 1980s, during the restoration of a monastic folio found in a private collection, scholars uncovered a palimpsest, a reused parchment, beneath a later 15th century theological treatise. Beneath it was a prayer, possibly written by Brother Tullis himself. Domine si ventus venit aetrum, de nobis sensum ad intellegendum. Lord, if the wind comes again, grant us the sense to understand it. It is a plea not for protection, but for comprehension. A subtle difference, but one that separates medieval mysticism from the early edges of inquiry. The plea remains unanswered. Reflections for the modern listener. Today, meteorologists can model wind shear, detect microbursts with Doppler radar, and issue tornado warnings with seconds to spare. But in 1341, the people of Lincolnshire had only the smell of air, the bend of trees, and the silence before motion. Still, their response wasn't far off from ours. Observe, react, rebuild. The names change, the tools evolve, but human adaptation is a long, unbroken line built not on revolutions, but on moments like these. A child vanishing without a scream. A cart found flipped in a still field. A monk scratching out doubt in a margin. And the wind always moving on. And so we end with a thought. If forgotten winds shaped roof beams, altered tax rolls, and redefined silence, how many other forces in history have we mistaken for nothing at all? Story 2. The disappearing village of Fischbeck, Saxony, 1054. Before we speak of disappearance, we must first speak of existence. Fischbeck was a small village in Lower Saxony, Germany, though even that phrasing is misleading. In 1054, there was no Germany in the way we now understand it. Fischbeck was a settlement under the Duchy of Saxony, within the Holy Roman Empire, itself a tangled web of bishoprics, principalities, and feudal obligations. Nestled near the banks of the Weser River, just a few miles from the Benedictine Fischbeck Abbey, founded in 955, the village likely consisted of wooden and stone-framed homes, tilled plots, and no more than a few dozen souls. Today, the abbey still stands. The village does not. When a place fades from the map. In an 11th century imperial survey compiled under Emperor Henry III, who reigned from 1039 to 1056, Fischbeck is briefly mentioned in a tithing document. Et vicus ixta flumen, in comitatu Heremani, reddens molendinum unum et vacas septum. And a village near the river, under the countship of Herman, yielding 1 mill and 7 cows. 7 cows, 1 mill. It was not a place of military importance. It held no shrine, no relic, no university. It would never make a map. But in 1054, something happened. Because by 1060, Fischbeck is no longer mentioned in any surviving records, not in tithe rolls. not in land disputes, not in ecclesiastical logs. And its absence was noted centuries later by Wilhelm Stadelmann, a 19th century archivist cataloging monastic papers from Fischbeck Abbey. In the margins of a reprinted tithing list, he scribbled, "Quid diviculo Fischbeck, silentium post annum 1054, evaporavitni." What became of the village of Fischbeck? Silence after the year 1054. Did it evaporate? Evaporation or erosion. To evaporate is a poetic metaphor. But more likely, the land changed. The Weser River has always been prone to seasonal flooding. Long before the age of industrial canal control, villages near its banks risked inundation during spring thaws and autumn rains. But floods were common and villages adapted. What made 1054 different? Several clues suggest a meteorological anomaly, a sudden surge of wind, or weather so severe that it did more than damage buildings, it may have removed them entirely, or rendered the land uninhabitable. An entry in the Fischbeck Abbey's manuscript of homilies, dated Anno Domini 1054, in Mens Octobris reads, "Ora orda post nonem, procella sine pluvia, et silva fracta ut per manum invisibilum." A wind rose after the 9th hour, a storm without rain, and the forest broken as if by an invisible hand. Further down the same page, a darker phrase appears. "Homo divico piscatorio in flumen repertis, oculis vacuus." A man from the fishing village found in the river, eyes empty. The phrase oculis vacuus could refer to trauma, injury, or even death by exposure. In some medieval texts, it is shorthand for missing eyes, a poetic symbol for divine punishment, but also a potential indicator of wind-propelled debris injuries. Was there a tornado? Germany is no stranger to tornadoes, though they are rare and often weak. However, the flat plains of Lower Saxony, where warm air from the south can occasionally meet cold northern fronts, create the potential for rotating storm cells. In 2005, researchers from the University of Hanover reviewed historical weather phenomena in the Weser Basin. A footnote in their study mentions an unusual pattern of wind damage, recorded in abbey logs from the 11th century, including accounts from Fischbeck and Hamelin. The pattern is consistent with no precipitation, sudden onset, localized destruction, spiral or clearing, behavior areas stripped of vegetation in roughly circular patterns. They stop short of calling it a tornado, as the terminology and data are speculative. But they suggest that a tornadic microburst or even a waterspout crossing from the Weser could explain the abandonment of Fischbeck. The abbey's role in its silence. Fischbeck Abbey, unlike the village, continued to operate for centuries. It was a canoness's house, a monastery for noblewomen who followed a modified Benedictine rule. The abbey served as both a religious and administrative hub for the surrounding lands. So why didn't they document the village's disappearance in greater detail? Possibly because the land was simply reassigned. Monastic communities were often pragmatic. If a village flooded or was destroyed, its land might be redistributed to another manor or converted into grazing pasture. Alternatively, the disappearance might have been seen as divine will, not to be questioned. In the margins of a prayer book copied in 1055, a brief note. Terra qua visae furunt nunc vacua, memoriam non agimus, nisi in oration. The land where the villages were is now empty. We do not remember except in prayer. This tone suggests a resigned detachment, not conspiracy or cover-up. The village was gone and life continued. The abbey thrived. The cows were likely relocated. An absent voice. What is most striking about Fischbeck's disappearance is who does not speak. No surviving letters from villagers. No peasant testimonies. No family chronicles. This is the problem of small history. The lower classes, especially in the 11th century, rarely left behind first-hand records. Their stories survive only through absence when they stop appearing in tithe lists, in court rolls, in tax collections. Fischbeck, it seems, disappeared between one season and the next, quietly, entirely. Perhaps it flooded. Perhaps it was struck by a twisting wind from the river. Perhaps, in its final moments, it simply dissolved into mud, wood, and memory. The modern field. Today, aerial archaeology in Lower Saxony has located several soil depressions and subsurface anomalies near the Weser, just southeast of the abbey believed to be the footprint of the original village. No visible ruins remain. Local farmers occasionally turn up charred wood fragments or field stones in unnatural clusters, suggesting destruction by pressure or heat, not gradual decay. Some stones are deeply buried, implying forceful downward movement consistent with high winds or water erosion. No church bell, no altar stone, no graves have been recovered, which raises a chilling possibility. Either the village was never large enough to warrant a cemetery, or the cemetery was washed away. And so we are left with a question. If a village disappears and no one writes about it, does it still shape history? Or are the stories of small places only real if someone remembers to record them? As the 11th century progressed, Fischbeck's absence became a non-event. Other villages rose, others fell, the world turned. The Holy Roman Empire dealt with rebellions, reforms, and rising papal power. The investiture controversy would soon upend the balance between secular and spiritual rule. But in a bend of the Weser River, a handful of former foundations slowly disappeared beneath soil and moss. And yet, like a stone beneath a moving stream, the disappearance of Fischbeck shaped its surroundings not through drama, but through the shifting patterns of land, memory, and silence. In this section, we explore how the void left by a lost village was acknowledged without being named, and how memory, deliberate or accidental, preserves history in unexpected places. The Abbey's quiet expansion. After 1054, Fischbeck Abbey appears to have undergone a subtle but significant expansion in both holdings and influence. A charter dated 1059, preserved in the archives of Corvey Abbey, records a grant of vacant land by the river to the Fischbeck canonesses. The land is unnamed but described. Terram vastum ubi furunt structuri in plano flumines. Wasted land where structures once stood on the river's plain. This is likely the formal absorption of the village's footprint. The abbey did not rebuild the village. Instead, the land became open pasture and, later, fruit orchards tended by lay brothers and servants. A marginal note by a scribe in the late 11th century describes it simply as Terram silenti, the silent land. There's a religious humility in this name, but also a collective forgetting. The land was renamed not with bitterness but with reverence for quiet. No shrine, no monument, just a field, a place not to speak of. Echoes in regional folklore. In the Hameln region, just upstream from Fischbeck, oral traditions survived longer than written records. A 16th century Protestant pastor named Martin Kremer compiled local sayings and rural superstitions. Among them was a curious entry. When der Weserwind von Süden kommt, nimm des Vieh heim. When the Weser wind comes from the south, bring the livestock home. The phrase suggests a folk memory of sudden windstorms, and possibly their connection to livestock loss, a recurring theme in 11th century manorial records. In another entry, Kremer refers to the drowned hamlet, said to lie beneath a stretch of the river that bends like a monk's tonsure. While no name is given, the description fits the topography near Fischbeck Abbey. Was this a mythologized memory of the vanished village? Or just a cautionary tale? It's difficult to say, but when folk memory preserves geography, it often points to a real loss transformed over time into ritual and rhythm. What the priests didn't say. Parish priests in medieval Saxony were tasked with more than just the sacraments. They were witnesses to births and deaths, collectors of tithes, and custodians of oral tradition. Yet in the ecclesiastical records of Minden diocese, under which Fischbeck fell, there are no obituaries, no mass dedications, and no mentions of Fischbeck village after 1054. This omission is striking. It suggests that no official death toll was recorded, that there was no plague, no martyrdom, no disaster worthy of spiritual note. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that the villagers fled before or after the event. But where did they go? In 1056, a charter for the nearby village of Grossenwitten lists an unusual surge in new tenancies from river land. Several of the names in this list, Adalbrecht, Gotha, Liutfried, also appear in Fischbeck's 1053 rent roll. This may be our strongest indication that some villagers survived, resettled, and were absorbed into other communities without ceremony. A quiet migration, a life restarted. The monastery bell. Perhaps the most poignant relic of Fischbeck's vanishing is the bell of St. Walburga, reportedly housed in the abbey tower for centuries. Though not definitively linked to the village, the bell's Latin inscription reads, Eram in voce vici, nunc sum in silentio Dei. I was the voice of the village, now I am in God's silence. This inscription was added later, likely in the 13th century, but oral tradition held that the bell was salvaged from the wreckage of the village church and recast for the abbey. It may not be true, or it may be the last physical trace of Fischbeck's community. The bell remained in use until the 30 Years' War, when it was cracked by cannon fire. Its remains were melted down in the 18th century, thus completing the cycle of disappearance. The tension between survival and memory. When we speak of the Middle Ages, we often imagine a world filled with plague, battle, and fire. But for most people, life was slow, repetitive, and tethered to place. To lose that place, to watch it vanish without witness or record, was a profound kind of rupture. And yet medieval people were resilient in a way that was almost unconscious. If your village vanished, you moved. If your house flooded, you rebuilt. If your harvest failed, you prayed and tried again. You did not expect justice, you expected change. What makes Fischbeck's story so haunting is not the violence of its disappearance, but the gentleness of its erasure. No mass grave, no cursed ruins, just a shift from habitation to pasture, from known to forgotten. A 20th century discovery. In 1938, during field work for a Nazi-era Heimat, homeland, project aimed at glorifying ancient German settlements, archaeologists from the University of Göttingen surveyed the fields around Fischbeck Abbey. Though politically motivated, the project yielded genuine data. Among their findings, charred timber remnants 1.5 meters below current soil level, a circular stone foundation suggestive of a Romanesque chapel, several human teeth, possibly scattered burials unmarked. But the regime suppressed the findings. The disappearance of a weak, vulnerable village did not fit the ideological narrative. The data was quietly shelved. It resurfaced only in the 1990s, when independent historians re-examined the notes, still unverified, but compelling. And so we are left with another question. When does a place die? Is it the moment its last stone falls, or the moment its name is no longer spoken? You might imagine the story of Fischbeck concludes with ruins, bones in the earth, a plaque on a wall, or perhaps the tragic entry in some abbot's yearbook. But Fischbeck has no monument, no graves recovered, no ruins visited, no festival in its honor. Instead, what remains is absence and instructive silence in the historical record, a cluster of displaced names in manorial charters, and a river that continues to flow without acknowledging what it once stole. In this final section, we reflect on the meaning of loss, not just in material terms, but in the way it shapes administration, religion, and ultimately, memory itself. The administrative machine carries on. In the 11th century, the loss of a small village wasn't met with alarm, it was met with realignment. Documents from the Reichsabtei Corvey, a powerful Benedictine abbey downstream on the Weser, show that after 1054, the tithes once associated with Fischbeck were redistributed to 3 surrounding villages. Hessisch-Oldendorf gained grazing lands. Grossenwitten absorbed laborers. Rehrin took the livestock rights. This wasn't scandalous, it was bureaucratic efficiency. Land did not die when people left it. Land remained a resource, a line in an account book, a lineage of ownership and obligation. Monastic and feudal systems were well equipped to forget people but remember soil. In that sense, Fischbeck ceased to exist as a community, but continued to exist as a set of reallocated assets. What remained in the soil? In the 21st century, modern techniques like aerial photography, magnetometry, and ground-penetrating radar have revealed anomalies near the Fischbeck Abbey. Findings include linear ditches consistent with long-lost field boundaries, charcoal-rich soil layers suggestive of fire, subtle circular foundations indicating a ring of dwellings around a central space, likely the original village plan. Curiously, these features correspond with no current habitation, nor any post-11th century mapping. It's as if the land, once abandoned, remained so deliberately. Even local farmers avoid plowing too deeply in the Abbey Low fields, citing poor yields and unsettled ground. While no curse is spoken aloud, oral tradition still refers to the area as Der Stumm Grund, the mute ground. Even today, the land retains a certain social memory, even if its origin has been forgotten. Theology of forgetting. It may be tempting to imagine medieval Christianity as obsessed with remembering saints' feast days, relics, martyrologies, and long genealogies. But it was equally concerned with intentional forgetting. To forget a sin, to forgive a debt, to abandon the cursed, these were all spiritual acts. In this context, Fischbeck's disappearance was not necessarily an accident of history, but perhaps a chosen silence. The abbey's choice not to commemorate, the priest's refusal to record, may reflect a sacralized forgetting, the belief that some things were best left unspoken, if not unseen. A field may be plowed anew, but a story buried by the church was buried deeply. Displaced memory in the landscape. Walk the Weser River path today and you'll find no signs to Fischbeck village, but certain features feel out of place. A copse of trees in a perfect square. A footpath that ends abruptly at an open field. A well sealed with iron and marked only by a worn stone with no inscription. These are not definitive artifacts, they're not proof, but they're interruptions, gaps in the ordinary. And often, history lives in these gaps. The same way a paused breath in conversation can tell you more than words, the discontinuities in land use, in place names, in the rhythm of settlement can offer us glimpses of stories too fragile to survive intact. The people who left. Of all the elements in Fischbeck's story, the people are the most difficult to trace. The administrative reshuffling provides evidence of labor absorption, but not of emotional displacement. Where did they go? How did they explain the loss? In a tax record from 1067, a woman named Goda Filia Lietberti is listed as a tenant by favor in Grossenwitten. No one asks where she came from, but her name also appears in the last Fischbeck livestock roll of 1053. A young girl then, a woman by 1067. She survived, she resettled. Perhaps she told her children stories of a wind or a river or a morning when everything changed. But we have no journal, only a name, a location, a silence between two entries in time. What the river took. The Weser River, placid now, may well have been the agent of destruction. A sudden flood, a lateral wind across its waters, a waterspout rare but possible. Yet the river gives no testimony. It has no memory, no bias. It doesn't distinguish between sacred and profane, sinner and saint. It only flows. And in its path it sometimes takes without reason, without witness, without warning. Fischbeck was not unique in that, but its loss gives us a case study of how fragile a place is when it lacks champions, and how history does not mourn what it cannot record. The role of boring history. In our modern minds, we often favor the spectacular, the eruption, the conquest, the decisive battle. But Fischbeck's story offers something different: a slow catastrophe, a quiet removal, and a bureaucratic afterlife that says more about the medieval world's pragmatism than its poetry. There is no hero, no villain, no conclusive ending. Just a field where people once lived, and now do not. A closing reflection. The story of Fischbeck challenges us to rethink what counts as historical importance. If a village is too small to leave a stone behind, does that make it less meaningful? Or does it remind us that most of history is made up of lives like these, brief, localized, significant only to those who lived them? Fischbeck teaches us that even the absence of history is a kind of presence, a negative space that shapes the contours of what we know and what we don't. And so we end with a thought. Is forgetting a form of survival? Or is it just another way the past hides from us, waiting for the moment when a story quiet, minor, and terribly human rises once more from the fields? Story 3. Chronicles from the Cloisters, Japanese Monks and the Heavenly Whirl, Kyoto, 1179. Before the shoguns, before the great stone castles, and long before Japan became a unified state, it was a land of shrines, scrolls, and storms. The year was 1179, and Kyoto, then known as Heian-kyo, was nearing the end of its role as the center of classical court life. Japan was not yet a country of generals and warlords, but of cloistered emperors, court intrigue, and deeply devout monks who watched the skis as closely as they read the sutras. In a secluded temple on the city's northern edge, monks recorded a wind that defied description. It was not just destructive, it was strange. And their description of this heavenly whirl remains one of the earliest known Japanese accounts of what may have been a tornado-like phenomenon. Kyoto, 1179, a capital in flux. The late Heian period, 794–1185, was marked by subtle decline. The imperial court still glittered with poetry, incense, and etiquette, but its political influence was waning, eclipsed by warrior clans, most notably the Taira and Minamoto families. In 1179, the country teetered on the edge of civil war. The Genpei War would erupt just 2 years later. But amidst this mounting tension, life at the temple known as Shakokuin, nestled in the foothills north of the capital, followed a predictable rhythm: morning sutras, midday chores, evening meditations. The monks transcribed Buddhist texts, recorded dreams, measured eclipses, and quietly took note of the world's dissonance. It was in the record of the abbot's observances, Joinkai, that a strange entry appears. The clouds moved without motion, a low cry in the air. The sky turned upon itself. The trees bowed low, then rose, then scattered, then all was still. The event, autumn, 1179. The event occurred on the 9th day of the 9th month. By the old Japanese lunisolar calendar, a day modern historians place in early October. The monks had prepared for the chrysanthemum festival, a seasonal rite meant to purify the body and mind in alignment with autumn's decline. But just after midday, as the festival arrangements were underway, the sky described in the journal as flat and silver tightened. According to the account, a ring of wind formed above the temple's central courtyard, causing small stones to lift into the air. the paper walls of the guest house to tear inward. A gust that stripped the bark from a cypress tree without disturbing its branches. This last detail seems paradoxical, but the monk's notes continue. It was as if the wind descended from within, not without. They called it Tenrin, or heavenly wheel. Not a storm, not a rain, not a typhoon, but something else. A whirl. What did they witness? The monks lacked a meteorological vocabulary, but their descriptive skill was formidable. Their records suggest characteristics now recognized as tornadic. A tight, localized spiral of wind. No thunder or lightning. Sudden onset, lasting no more than a few minutes. Evidence of rotational force, objects lifted, then thrown. A path of damage approximately 20-30 meters wide. One account refers to the center of the wind as still like the eye of a Buddha, while the outer ring screamed like foxes. This description aligns with the calm center of a vortex, surrounded by violent edge winds. Given Kyoto's basin geography, where cool air from the surrounding mountains can occasionally clash with warmer air from the plains, it's plausible that a brief tornadic event occurred, something extremely rare, but not impossible. Theological interpretation. High-Nira Buddhism, especially in its Tendai and Shingon forms, incorporated esoteric cosmology. Weather was not just weather, it was often a sign, a manifestation of karmic imbalance. The chief abbot, a man named Sojin, wrote in the days following the event. Wind came not to destroy, but to awaken. What is loose will be taken. What is anchored will remain. No villagers were reported injured. No fires broke out. The temple's roofs were shaken but intact. Still, monks took the event as a celestial omen and intensified their ascetic practices, including fasting, night-long chanting, and even voluntary exposure to cold to simulate the shaking air. The belief was simple. If heaven had turned its eye upon them, they must not look away. How the people reacted. The villagers below the temple, in the district of Ikajoji, experienced the event differently. According to later chronicles, a small farming household was unroofed in silence, while a family's ** water jars shattered without falling. This suggests a rapid pressure drop, consistent with tornadic events, one that could rupture containers or even cause mild ear bleeding in some people, though no injuries are recorded in the temple logs. The local noble, a minor court official named Fujiwara no Arikuni, offered an official prayer of sky appeasement, requesting the wind spirit to return to the path of order. But he did not report it to court. It was too strange, too isolated, and too unworthy of bureaucratic entanglement. Instead, he donated new roof tiles to the temple and 2 bales of rice to the villagers, a practical solution to a mystical problem. A wordless conclusion. By the end of the month, the paper walls had been mended. The cypress bark never grew back. And the monks returned to their scrolls, the event eventually fading into a minor footnote in a long series of daily records, sandwiched between entries on wheat weevils and early frost. Only the phrase Tenrin heavenly wheel was passed down among monks as a kind of private shorthand, not for a specific event, but for any inexplicable change. A term used when something happened that defied explanation, but demanded reverence nonetheless. What did it mean? The monks never used the word omen explicitly. Instead, they framed the wind as a mirror, something that reflected disorder, whether in the heavens, in the court, or in their own hearts. Within 2 years, Kyoto would burn during the Genpei War. Temples would fall. Entire districts would vanish under the blades of the Tara and Minamoto clans. The monks of Shakokuin could not have known this, but their scrolls suggest a feeling of cosmic tension, something they could sense but not yet name. And perhaps the heavenly wheel was not just a meteorological event. Perhaps it was a turning of the age. And so we are left with a question. When a quiet wind spirals through a sacred place and disappears, what remains? The broken bark, the lifted stone, or the silence it leaves behind? In the weeks following the Tenrin, or heavenly wheel, the monks of Shakokuin resumed their daily rhythm. Scrolls were transcribed, meals prepared, rituals maintained. And yet something was different. In their writings and actions, we see the signs of a community trying to make sense of the unexplainable, not through science or investigation, but through cosmic reflection. The monks did not fear the wind, but they did not forget it. The abbot's response, turning inward. Abbot Sojin, then in his 42nd year of monastic service, began a series of evening talks shortly after the event, recorded in shorthand by junior scribes. These discourses, titled Reflections on the Unseen, were not meant for publication, but for internal understanding. In one, he says, "We ask why the wind turned inward, why it did not bring rain, why it did not warn us with thunder. But we are foolish to seek causes in the wind. It is the stillness before the wind that reveals our disarray." This reflects the Tendai concept of interdependent causality, NG, the idea that nothing arises independently, and every phenomenon reflects a larger imbalance. Sojin did not see the wind as punishment, he saw it as response, a cosmic echo of internal disorder. Austerities intensified. The monks, in turn, began practicing takuhatsu, a form of mendicant pilgrimage, walking barefoot into Kyoto's urban wards with alms bowls and chanting mantras. This was unusual. Shakokuin had not historically been a mendicant order. Its monks lived in relative self-sufficiency. But after the Tenrin, they turned outward, revering their usual cloistered posture. The message was clear. The wind had not struck from the outside, it had emerged from within. And so they would seek purification in the outside world. Records show that monks walked daily to the Kamigawa River, reciting the Heart Sutra 108 times. Meals were reduced to 1 bowl of rice gruel per day. All idle talk was suspended for 33 days, symbolizing Canon's 33 manifestations of mercy. Even the temple bell was silenced for a full lunar cycle. As one monk wrote, "When the air speaks, we must listen by being silent." The courtly silence. Interestingly, the Kyoto court made no official acknowledgement of the Tenrin. By late 1179, the imperial household was in crisis. Retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa was locked in a power struggle with Taira no Kiyomori, the ambitious military leader who had effectively become Japan's most powerful man. Kiyomori, seeing threats everywhere, staged a coup in the 12th month, only 2 months after the wind event, expelling his rivals and solidifying his dominance. In this context, a localized weather anomaly held no importance. The court scribes, focused on succession and scandal, omitted it entirely. And yet one court lady, Fujiwara no Nagako, a minor attendant, mentions it in her diary, Nagako no Nikki, writing, "The monks near the hills have ceased to ring their bells. They say the wind moved without cause. It frightened no one, yet unsettled many. The priests look hungry." This is a rare non-monastic reference, casual, almost dismissive, but proof that the event registered beyond the temple walls. Still, it remained an understory, not a headline. Literary reflections, wind as mirror. In the literary salons of Heian-kyo, nature was not merely observed, it was interpreted through metaphor, especially in waka poetry. Though no direct poetic account of the Tenrin survives, a sequence of poems dated spring 1180 from the poet-monk Ryosen includes the line, "The wind came down not to crush the temple bell but to ask, 'Are you awake?'" Ryosen had spent time at Shakokuin and likely witnessed the aftermath of the event. His verse suggests that the wind was not viewed as punishment, but as a call to attention, a kind of gentle haunting. Aftermath in the landscape. The monks began mapping the path of the wind through their grounds. On a vellum scroll now held at the Kyoto University Archive, there is a simple diagram showing the point of descent just east of the main hall, a spiraling pattern that moved west, bypassing most structures, a line of damaged trees marked with small prayer seals. They did not rebuild everything. One guest house, whose walls had been torn inward, was left to decay, eventually reclaimed by moss and time. It became known as the Silent Hut, used for solitary meditation, but never repaired. Ritualization of the event. By the following year, 1180, the monks had incorporated the Tenrin into their annual rites, not as a disaster, but as a moment of cosmic reminder. On the 9th day of the 9th month, they performed a silent procession around the temple perimeter. The offering of wind chimes to the Bodhisattva fusion as a symbol of transience. A reading from the Vimalakirti Sutra, which emphasizes the power of silence over speech. These rituals continued for nearly a century, until the temple was partially destroyed in the Annin War, 1467-1477. Even after, some of these customs survived in modified form in successor temples. The wind in Buddhist cosmology. In Buddhist cosmology, wind, vayu, is one of the 5 elements, representing movement, breath, and impermanence. But Heian period monks often linked wind with karmic fluctuation, a subtle, invisible force that revealed imbalances not through words, but through experience. The Tenrin thus became not a storm, but a teacher. It reminded monks that not all knowledge is found in sutras, and not all awakenings are gentle. And so we are left with a question. When a wind passes through a sacred place and asks nothing but silence in return, is it speaking to the world or simply reflecting it? There is a moment in Buddhist meditation, especially in the Tendai tradition, when the breath, the self, and the surroundings begin to dissolve. It is not an end nor a trance, but a transition, a turning, subtle but permanent. The monks of Shakokuin never named the Tenrin, the heavenly wheel that spun over their temple, as a miracle, nor did they label it divine punishment. They simply observed, reflected, and let the silence settle into their daily practice. But in the decades that followed, the wind's memory grew into something more than an event. It became a teaching in itself. Not recorded in doctrinal texts, not debated by scholars, but passed through ritual, habit, and weathered wood. The physical legacy. Though Shakokuin no longer exists in its original form, its traditions migrated into the nearby Maya Shinjai school, and traces survive in the form of wind chime offerings, still performed during the 9th month by certain monastic subtemples. A preserved fragment of the guest house wall, held today at the Kyoto Prefectural Museum, bearing diagonal splintering consistent with a pressurized gust. A simple carved tablet, once thought to be decorative, now interpreted as a stylized rendering of a spiral wind, possibly commemorating the event. In the roof beams of one subtemple, careful observers note that they bear the faint burnished markings of successive repairs, always in the same segment of the compound. Not from fire, not from time, but from a wind that once curled downward from a silver sky. The scroll that almost disappeared. In 1913, a rare collection of Heian period monastic logs was found in a private estate in Kyoto. Among them was a partial copy of the Joinkai, the same observance journal that had noted the Tenrin centuries before. The scroll, damaged and faint, included this passage, long overlooked. When the turning wind visited, we were not prepared, but we understood enough to bow. The air has no face, no mind, yet it stirs the self more deeply than words. The scroll's rediscovery revived interest in weather as spiritual metaphor, and drew attention from both Zen historians and early meteorologists. curious about what the ancients may have observed. A small paper was published in 1936 by meteorologist Yuta Tatsuro, proposing that the monks had witnessed a vertical axis vortex, akin to a non-condensing landspout, a weak tornado lacking a full cloud funnel. Though his claims were largely dismissed at the time, they've since been revisited by Japanese historical climatologists seeking to trace pre-instrumental extreme weather events. The Wind and the Warrior Era. Shortly after the Tenrin, the Genpei War erupted an open conflict between the Taira and Minamoto clans. Kyoto, once serene and ceremonial, became a city of burned gates, looted temples, and roaming soldiers. Many temples were destroyed, monks fled, sacred scrolls were hidden in mountains or burned on palace floors. But Shakokuin survived at least for a time, partly due to its remote location and partly due to its reputation for silence. It was seen not as a center of power or riches, but of restraint. In war, quiet becomes a kind of protection. And perhaps the monks had learned this not from emperors, but from the wind. A lasting influence on Zen. Though Shakokuin was a Tendai temple, its legacy bled into the emerging Zen tradition. One Zen master of the early Kamakura period, Mugaku Sojin, reportedly said to his disciples, "The mind should be like the heavenly whirl, centered but moving." Whether or not he referenced the 1179 event, the metaphor is revealing. It suggests that the wind's shape, its motion without direction, had become a symbol within the monastic vocabulary, not destructive, but deeply instructional. Zen, with its emphasis on impermanence, non-duality, and direct experience, found in such natural phenomena a kind of living koan, a question that cannot be answered, only lived. And so the Tenrin, without being canonized, became an image passed from teacher to student, not as fact, but as truth. A place remembered in practice, not name. Today, few in Kyoto know the name Shakokuin. Its grounds are part of a residential district. There is no shrine, no signpost, no gift shop. But each year, in a few Zen sub-temples scattered across Kyoto, on the 9th day of the 9th month, monks hang wind chimes from exposed rafters, walk barefoot in single file along garden paths, recite one line from the Heart Sutra, then fall into silence. The ritual takes only minutes. There is no mention of the wind, but its presence is felt in the stillness, in the listening, in the way leaves rustle above bowed heads. The last entry. The final known reference to the Tenrin comes not from a monk, but from a peasant. In a 13th century folktale collection titled Kiden Shu, a story tells of a wandering carpenter who rebuilt a broken guest house north of Kyoto. He worked alone, said nothing, and when asked why he labored in silence, replied, "The air once turned here, it has not finished speaking." A thought to carry. What is history, if not the study of the air that once turned us? Sometimes it arrives with thunder, sometimes with fire. And sometimes, as in Kyoto in 1179, it arrives with no sound at all. Just a spiral in the sky and a question left behind. And so we end with a thought. Is it possible that the most enduring lessons in history are not the ones shouted in battle or etched into stone, but the ones whispered in the wind, heard only by those who knew how to listen? Story 4. The deadly spiral tornadic weather on the Baltic trade routes, Lübeck, 1287. In the late 13th century, the Baltic Sea was not yet tamed by cartography or naval supremacy. It was traded upon, feared, and most of all endured. The town of Lübeck, capital of the burgeoning Hanseatic League, had become the lifeblood of northern Europe's maritime commerce. Its merchants, known as Kaufleute, oversaw vast cargoes of salted fish, beeswax, wool, and timber that traveled between Flanders, Novgorod, and London. But this trade came with peril, piracy, ice, and, as we shall see, wind. In 1287, An account preserved in the Merchant Brothers' ledger Kaufbruderbüch records an extraordinary storm that struck not only the coastline, but vessels mid-journey with such suddenness and violence that survivors described it as the sky descending. This was no gale. This was something spiral, unnamed, and deeply feared. Lübeck, the Queen of the Hands. By 1287, Lübeck was already one of the most powerful cities on the Baltic. It was well fortified, meticulously organized, and operated under its own city laws, Lübisches Recht, which were influential across northern Germany. The city's merchants had pioneered the use of the cog ship, a wide-bodied, deep-hulled vessel ideal for the rough northern seas. Cogs were sturdy, but cumbersome, their square sails reliant on stable wind. And so, when wind turned from ally to enemy, few ships could adapt quickly. That summer, a fleet of 7 cogs set sail for Visby on the island of Gotland, part of a routine trade convoy bringing linen, brass, and grain. Their departure was marked in the port ledger on the 15th day of July, 1287. 5 returned. 2 were never seen again. The ledger account. The Kaufbruderbüch, maintained by the Merchant Guild and stored in Lübeck's archives, includes this stark entry. Of the 7 ships departed under fair sky, 2 were lost beneath a black wheel of wind. Survivors speak of a pillar turning from the sea, drawing air as a mouth draws breath. This is not ordinary language for mariners. The Hanseatic merchants were known for their precise, almost painfully boring record-keeping, bushels weighed, cords counted, cargo tallied. And yet here the language turns metaphorical, almost desperate. A black wheel of wind, a mouth drawing breath. Such imagery suggests more than just a sudden squall. It suggests rotation, suction, and a narrow corridor of destruction. The survivors report. 1 partial letter survives, dictated by a merchant's apprentice named Walmer Bleck. Preserved in fragmentary Latin and Middle Low German, it was sent to his employer's widow. It rose not from the sky but from the water and spun so that our sail did twist as a shirt wrung dry. Geiselbrecht cried out, then was taken. I saw no storm cloud, only the whirling, then silence. Walmer survived aboard the Heilige Katharina, which had lagged behind the main convoy due to rudder trouble. He claimed that 2 ships, Gut Segel and Recht Handeln, were drawn toward a turning sea cloud and vanished. No wreckage was recovered. His description is chilling in its specificity. A spiraling motion from sea upward. Rotational damage to sails and rigging. Sudden onset, no thunder or visible lightning. The sound of wind likened to cloth being torn in water. Today, this reads as consistent with what we might now classify as a waterspout, a marine tornado. The nature of Baltic waterspouts. The Baltic Sea, despite its chill and narrowness, is capable of producing summer waterspouts, especially when warm air from the continent clashes with cooler marine layers. These phenomena are rare but documented, and often form quickly during periods of high-pressure instability. Unlike the massive tornadoes of the American Midwest, waterspouts in the Baltic are usually narrow, brief, and highly localized. But for a 13th century crew, even a brief spiral could destroy a ship unable to turn fast enough, especially with rigging caught by an upward draft. Modern meteorological reconstruction based on regional data suggests that July 1287 was unusually warm in northern Europe, increasing the likelihood of instability over the cooler sea surface. Could the Black Wheel of Wind have been the first documented Baltic waterspout to sink multiple vessels? It's plausible, but at the time there were no instruments, only stories. Reactions in Lübeck. When word of the disaster returned, there was no public outcry, no funerals. The Hanseatic League operated under mercantile fatalism. Loss was inevitable, and every journey had a price. However, port customs show a brief spike in insurance premiums for the following month, suggesting that even the pragmatic merchants were spooked. Some ships delayed departure. Others took alternate routes via Calmer. A priest was invited to bless the docks, a rare gesture in a guild that emphasized economics over ritual. An annotated margin in the port ledger reads, "Let the wind be measured not in sails, but in prayers." The sky and the church. The church did not offer theological framing, at least not publicly. But a monk from the Marienkirche, Brother Theodore, included this in his weather notes. The sea drew upward, not in tide but in shape, God's finger perhaps, but to what end? This brief speculation indicates that even clergy were unsettled. They could explain thunder as divine anger, drought as moral failing, but a spinning column of air that rose from the water. It fit no sermon. And so it was quietly filed away, its memory kept in margins, in rumor, and in the absence of two ships that were never found. Cartographic caution. In the years that followed, Hanseatic maps of the Baltic began marking the Central Sea with a curious icon, a spiraling pattern above the waves. It did not appear on all maps, nor was it labeled. But on the Gatlandic Nautical Scroll, circa 1295, the space near the 1287 incident shows a coiled spiral, drawn in faded ink, alongside the note. Hic ventus silit, est non dormitat. Here the wind is silent, but not asleep. The spiral icon persisted in Baltic maritime charts for nearly a century, not as a warning, not as a known hazard, but as a reminder that beneath trade, timber, and tariffs, the sky itself had a will. And so we are left with a question. When the wind rises not to be seen, but to take, what is it we mourn, the loss of life, the loss of explanation, or the growing understanding that the sea answers to no law? The Hanseatic League was founded on a principle both simple and relentless: predictability. Merchants depended on routine, from tides to tolls, from contracts to wine charts. They measured risk in grain sacks and guild shares, not omens. But after the events of July 1287, the sea was no longer merely a highway. It had spoken, it had twisted. And for a moment, one quiet, bureaucratic moment, wind became something more than wind. A merchant's memory. Walmer Bleck, the surviving apprentice from the doomed convoy, returned to Lübeck in early August. He was, by most accounts, a young man of modest intelligence but deep loyalty. He never captained a ship again. In a letter transcribed posthumously by his great-nephew, a notary in Rostock, we read, "I did not drown, but I did not come back either. Part of me stayed with the turning air, not as a soul but as a question that I still hear when sails rise too fast." This line was later quoted in Hanseatic literature classes not for its poetry, but for its testament to fear without name. Bleck's testimony was not unique in its emotional depth, but it was rarely preserved. Most merchant loss records reduced events to weights lost, cargoes unrecovered, and names struck from rosters. But this single voice, fragmented though it is, suggests that the wind of 1287 lived on not in disaster narratives, but in personal unease. Economic impact, ripples in commerce. Though no major port closures were recorded, the insurance ledgers of Lübeck and Wismar reveal an interesting anomaly in late summer 1287. Freight insurance rates jumped nearly 40% for all ships crossing to Gotland. New clauses appeared in policies, noting events of spiraling wind or sudden sky motion. A short-term shipping preference was given to roundabout land-sea routes via Scanner and Calmer. These changes suggest that merchants, while not superstitious, adjusted their behavior in light of the July incident. The most fascinating document from this period is a revised risk schedule issued by the Kaufleut Guild, listing Wetterlauf unbekannt, weather course unknown, as a high-severity, low-frequency risk previously unlisted. This was the first time Lübeck's trade elite codified uncertainty without nomming it. The black wheel of wind had entered the ledger. The winds in Hanseatic lore. The Hanseatic League did not traffic in myths. It trafficked in cloth, fish, resin, and iron. Yet oral traditions among sailors, passed down along the docks of Danzig, Riga, and Tallinn, included murmurs of a force called Der Still Drawler, the silent spinner. It was never drawn, never defined, only referenced in phrases like, "Reef the sails quick, lest the drawler hears." "No flags on calm days, you don't summon the spinner." Folklorists debate whether this figure was a late corruption of older Norse wind myths, such as Kari, the personification of air. But sailors do not need theology. They need explanation that floats. And for those who had seen sails twist and rigging snap without a cloud in the sky, the silent spinner became a way to honor the unspeakable. Spiritual interventions. The Marienkirche, Lübeck's grand cathedral, was not known for maritime blessings. Its clergy focused on liturgical consistency and civic authority. But in September 1287, a small but curious service was conducted, Mass against the roaming air. The entry, found in a liturgical ledger, describes a votive ceremony. A silver censer swung outdoors, facing northward toward Gotland. Psalms associated with the scattering wind were read aloud. Monks placed salt and ashes on the eastern cornerstones of the churchyard. This is the only such service recorded in Lübeck that year. It does not reference the July incident directly, but the timing just weeks after the fleet's loss implies a communal response to something feared but not fully known. The two lost ships. The Gut Segel and wrecked Handeln are listed in maritime records as missing, presumed sunk. No wreckage was found, no bodies recovered. Years later, in 1302, a report from the Weak Lighthouse Authority noted the finding of a timber beam with Lübeck branding, washed ashore on the southern tip of Erland Island far from the last known location of the convoy. It bore scorch marks. Its grain was twisted unnaturally. It was warped, as if wrenched and released. Modern historians have speculated on this beam as a potential tornadic artifact damaged not by waves, but by sudden rotational force. It now resides, unlabeled, in the basement of the Lübeck City Museum. Few visit it. Fewer still ask what it means. The nomming that never happened. Despite multiple references, the event of 1287 was never given a name, not in port records, not in city chronicles, not in later sermons. Unlike plagues, fires, or invasions, a rogue wind offered no narrative. No enemy, no hero, no moment of triumph, only two ships that failed to arrive, and a spinning silence that left no lines for the poets. And so we are left with a question. If the wind turns and no one names it, does it remain forgotten, or does it carve its memory into wood, into sails, into the space between caution and fear? By the end of summer 1287, the town of Lübeck had resumed its routine. Ships arrived and departed, tariffs were collected, barrels of herring rolled through cobbled streets, contracts were inked in Latin, Low German, and sometimes even in Old Norse. The two missing ships, quietly replaced in the ledgers. The prayers for them, said then forgotten. The survivors, moved on or did their best to. But the wind, that strange, spinning absence, was harder to replace. It had left no scar on the harbor, no ruin on the church. And yet, for the men who traded across the Baltic, it had altered the horizon. The invisible lesson. The Hanseatic League prized efficiency over superstition. It did not create saints for storms, nor festivals for the drowned. Instead, it created clauses, port advisories, and eventually, navigational heuristics that would inform its maritime code for centuries. Following the July 1287 incident, Guilds instituted new wind watch protocols, requiring junior crew to observe the sky during calm periods, not just during threatening weather. Night sailing across central Baltic lanes was suspended temporarily in high summer. The use of telltale's wind indicators on high masts was standardized and noted in vessel logs. No decree mentioned the spiral, but the silence of that summer had entered the architecture of caution. The League had listened, even if it refused to say aloud what it had heard. The spinner in later documents. In a 14th century Hanseatic seaman's manual, copied in Visby, there's a curious entry in the section on emergency seamanship. In calm waters, if the sail flaps thrice against windless air, lower all. If deck breathes but flag lies, beware. The air may spiral from underneath. No name is used, no reference to God, devil, or fate. But this passage, repeated in other port city manuals across the Baltic, shows that the idea of upward wind, or wind with no wind, had entered the lexicon of caution. In this way, the 1287 spiral became not a story, but a rule. Not memorialized, but remembered in the body, in action, in the decision to furl a sail early. The cultural ghost. Maritime ghost stories are typically loud: phantom ships, sirens, sea monsters. But the silent spinner was different. In a coastal tavern tale told in Riga during the 15th century, a drunken trader mumbles. You don't see the worst of the sea. You hear it breathing and don't know it's awake. Whether that tale traces to 1287 or not, it reflects a growing cultural acknowledgement of non-violent, yet deadly wind events, ones that neither announced themselves nor left tangible damage. And so, the Baltic began to carry with it not just danger, but ambiguity. What modern science suggests. In 2009, a group of German climatologists undertook a project mapping historical anomalous wind events in Northern Europe based on pre-instrumental records. Among the earliest entries, Lübeck, July 1287. Their reconstruction based on weather patterns, see surface temperature proxies, and a review of trade logs suggests the event may have been a mesocyclonic waterspout, rare for the Baltic but not impossible in years of elevated air-sea temperature contrasts. They were careful not to retrofit modern terminology into medieval texts, but their conclusion was clear. The 1287 incident shows features consistent with rotational wind convergence, with vertical velocity sufficient to damage rigging and disrupt surface water. The loss of 2 cogs is likely tied to this weather anomaly. In other words, the monks and merchants weren't imagining things. They just lacked the words. What was lost? It's easy to tally the material. 2 ships, several dozen men, an unknown amount of cargo, possibly cloth, possibly wax. But what remains more fascinating is what was not lost. The League adapted. Trade continued. No war followed. No plague was blamed. No witch was burned. Instead, the 1287 spiral became a quiet hinge, a moment when one of the most powerful merchant systems in medieval Europe learned to adjust to the unpredictable. Not through myth, not through law, but through margin notes, procedural tweaks, and memory. The beam in the museum. If you visit the Lübeck City Museum, there is a beam in the basement. No sign marks its origin. No display case frames its significance. But if you ask the archivist, a kind woman with half glasses and a fondness for ledger fonts, she might tell you. That's from the Gotland run, the summer they didn't come back. And if you lean close, you'll see the wood is warped, as though twisted slightly, not broken. The grain bent, the fibers stressed. Not by fire, not by blade, but by pressure from nowhere. Final reflection, wind as boundary. What makes the 1287 spiral so haunting is not just the damage it caused, but the way it blurred boundaries. Between air and sea, between calm and peril, between the known and the suspected. The Baltic had long been a route of commerce, but now it was also a holder of mystery. The Hanseatic League never claimed to master the sea. It only claimed to navigate it. And in 1287, the sea reminded its stewards that some things cannot be charted. And so we end with a thought. Is a forgotten storm still a lesson, if it survives not in words, but in hesitation in the cautious glance at a flag on a windless day? Story 5. The Whirling Winds of Al-Andalus, Cordoba, 976. Cordoba in 976 was a jewel of the Islamic world, a city of light, famed for its gardens, libraries, and aqueducts. At its heart stood the Caliphate of Cordoba, the most powerful and intellectually vibrant state in Western Europe. Its ruler, Al-Hakam II, reigned not as a conqueror, but as a scholar king. His court welcomed architects, poets, physicians, and astronomers from across the Mediterranean. Here, under the canopy of orange trees and the call to prayer, something strange occurred, a spiral in the air, quiet and swift, that tore at rooftops and palaces, leaving behind no storm, no explanation, and no clear enemy. The event would be remembered not as a disaster, but as a test of balance, and would be recorded in a way only Cordoba could, through poetry, science, and theology alike. Cordoba, seat of knowledge. To understand the impact of the strange wind of 976, one must understand Cordoba itself. By this time, the city had over 400,000 inhabitants, more than 70 libraries, and street lamps lining the avenues at night. The great mosque of Cordoba was still expanding, with its signature red and white horseshoe arches stretching like waves through the interior. Al-Hakam II, nearing the end of his reign, was a patron of scientific study, especially in the fields of astronomy and medicine. His personal library reportedly held over 400,000 volumes, a staggering number for any age. He employed court scholars to track celestial movements, measure atmospheric phenomena, and maintain official records of natural omens. Which is why, when an event occurred on a still morning in Shaban 365 AH, roughly May 976 CE, it did not go unrecorded. The incident, a turning wind without storm. The earliest account comes from the court scholar Ibn Khalaf al-Murri, a meteorologist and astronomer whose role was to chart stars and document weather patterns. In his now-lost treatise, quoted by later sources, he wrote, "From the eastern quarter of the city, a twisting air descended in silence. It moved not like a breeze, nor like the hot winds of the desert. It coiled, not unlike the serpent, and rose again before a cloud could form." This twisting air is described as narrow and cold, despite the morning heat. Al-Murri and his assistants observed the phenomenon from the observatory near the Alcazar palace fortress. In a letter copied later by Ibn Hazm, a young scholar at the time, the following effects were noted. Palm fronds stripped, but trees otherwise undisturbed. A stable's tiled roof lifted entirely, then dropped beside its walls. A servant was found dazed but unharmed, saying the air spoke. The servant's words were dismissed at the time, but repeated later in philosophical writings, as we'll see. Was this a tornado? Modern interpretation of the accounts suggests that Cordoba in 976 experienced a dustless landspout, or tornado, perhaps on the lower end of the Fujita scale EF0 or EF1. The region is not known for such events, but Cordoba's Guadalquivir Valley is a natural corridor for warm air surging from the south and cooler air masses descending from the Sierra Morena. While extremely rare, these conditions could cause vertical wind shear, especially during the hot, dry spring transition, when surface heating creates unstable atmospheric pockets. What makes this account striking is its detail. The lack of rain, lack of thunder, and tight columnar rotation suggest it was not a storm, but an isolated weather event, possibly a dry tornado or vortex. But without the language to describe such phenomena, even Cordoba's scientists reached for metaphor. The caliph's reaction. Al-Hakam II, ever the scholar, was reportedly intrigued, not alarmed. According to a preserved correspondence in the court archives, now in Madrid's Royal Academy, he instructed his advisors to consult ancient Greek and Persian weather texts, particularly works by Aristotle and Al-Razi. Compose a formal report comparing the event to known phenomena. Call for prayers, not for protection but for clarity. He viewed the turning air not as a punishment, but as a possible sign of imbalance between heaven and earth. In one preserved margin note, likely from his chief vizier, the caliph believes the wind is a mirror. What it reflects, we must interpret. The philosophical turn. Within weeks, Cordoban intellectual circles began using the wind incident as a metaphor for political and metaphysical uncertainty. A poem by Abu Amir al-Fadli, composed that same spring, reads, "The breath of the sky twists without rage, it does not strike, it asks." The court philosopher Ibn Masira, a pioneer of mystical rationalism, used the event to support his belief in hidden patterns within the material world, calling the whirlwind a subtle sign of the unseen order. He wrote, "The spiral is the form of all life, in shells, in stars, in breath. When the air turns visibly, it is the cosmos showing its blueprint." These interpretations show that the wind did more than damage property. It stirred the imagination of one of the most intellectually rich societies of its age. A curious detail. One of the most unusual elements of the reports is the consistent observation that animals fled or grew silent before the wind appeared. Pigeons nesting in the mosque rafters reportedly took flight moments before the event. Horses in the royal stables reared, unprovoked, then grew still. The phenomenon was so specific that Al-Murray included a special section in his treatise on animal behavior before atmospheric changes, possibly one of the earliest proto-scientific writings on precursor indicators. While we cannot prove causation, it echoes modern observations. Animals often respond to changes in barometric pressure and infrasound, both precursors to tornadic conditions. In Cordoba, even the birds seemed to understand something was about to turn. And so we are left with a question. When the wind rises without warning, when it touches nothing yet changes everything, do we call it weather or do we call it a message, waiting still for translation? The strange wind of spring 976 had passed in minutes. Yet in Cordoba, where memory was stored not just in stone but in scrolls, it lingered. Not as a feared omen, not as a superstition, but as a problem worth solving. In this section, we follow the wind through the minds of Cordoba's philosophers, engineers, and poets. For in Al-Andalus, even the air was examined, its weight, its movement, its meaning by those who believed that nothing in creation was without pattern, and no pattern was without purpose. The court inquiry, science responds. Al-Hakam II, despite declining health in his final year as caliph, convened a small circle of advisors to discuss the event. These included Ibn Khalaf al-Murri, court astronomer; Ishaq al-Turjali, a physician and student of Galenic theory; Yahya al-Qatubi, a civil engineer; Fatima bint al-Hassan, a lesser-known scholar of natural philosophy, noted for her commentary on the Book of Animals. Their observations and debate were recorded in the Kitab al-Dawr al-Kafi, Book of the Hidden Cycle, a treatise that survives only in fragments today, preserved in later citations. In this text, we find an extraordinary passage. Wind is not absence of air, but the motion of imbalance. If it turns in a circle, it does so in search of resolution. This sentence echoes Greek notions of elemental harmony, but also suggests a deeper, almost pre-scientific insight into atmospheric instability. Al-Murray proposed that the event was caused by al-tafawut, a disequilibrium between hot and cold airs trapped between the city's architecture and the river plain. We might today call this convection. The engineer's perspective. Yahya al-Qurtubi, the city's chief aqueduct inspector, took a practical view. His notes, buried in a long report about terrace repair, mention how the wind ripped small clay tiles from domes, but left the domes intact, lifted market awnings vertically, with little horizontal damage, toppled a cart with no sign of lateral force. From this, he drew two conclusions. The force came from below or within, not from one side or another. The phenomenon was too narrow to be a storm, but too strong to be dismissed. He did not call it a miracle. He called it a circle of disturbed breath. In a note scribbled between lines of measurement, perhaps the air turns when it cannot leave. Animals and infrasound. Observations of Fatima bint al-Hassan. Fatima, whose writings were mostly ignored by later chroniclers, recorded the behavior of animals with unusual care. Her notes from the 976 incident include dogs whining and packing in loops 1 hour before the wind, birds flying in erratic, low spirals, a pair of donkeys pressing their ears flat and refusing to walk forward. While her contemporaries offered only metaphor, Fatima suggested that the animals heard something humans could not. She described it as Zafir al-Lashe, the sigh of nothing. This has drawn modern speculation. Infrasound, a low-frequency vibration produced by wind patterns before tornadic activity, is inaudible to humans but perceptible to some animals. Fatima couldn't prove it, but she may have been one of the first people in recorded history to describe the animal response to pressure shifts, centuries before Doppler radar or pressure barometers. Her observations, bound in a manuscript now lost, were dismissed in her time, perhaps because they came from a woman, or perhaps because they described a wind no one wanted to remember. A city that refused to panic. Despite the strangeness of the event, there was no exodus, no fasting decree, and no sermon of doom. Why? Cordoba, in its golden age, was a city built on confidence in order. The architecture, the governance, even the calligraphy reflected a belief that divine harmony could be studied, mirrored, and understood. The spiral wind of 976, then, was not a threat, it was a riddle. A scholar's gift, a test of perspective. As one poet later wrote, "Let others flee the twist in the air. We will sit, observe, and let it pass through us." This calm response reveals a mindset both unique and fragile, a society on the cusp of turbulence, but still believing in its ability to think through the storm. What wasn't said? No record speaks of casualties, only confusion. No walls collapsed, no fires broke out, yet the descriptions are tinged with awe. In a letter from Al-Murray to his student, he ends with an odd line. The air turned on itself and found nothing, but still it turned. Here lies the core discomfort. The wind had no target, no mission, no lesson, yet it disrupted, questioned, rearranged. It became, for a brief moment, the central character in a city obsessed with control. A detail buried in dust. In 1882, during the partial restoration of the Alcazar of the Caliphs, workers uncovered a stone tile, cracked but intact, bearing the inscription 976, the year the air spoke. It was buried under newer brickwork. No one knows who carved it. It was not standard practice to mark years on paving stones. Some believe it was placed by a court scribe. Others say it was a philosophical jest. But its placement, beneath the walkway leading from the Caliph's gardens to the palace observatory, suggests that someone remembered. Not as tragedy, but as a whisper worth walking over every day. And so we are left with a question. When the wisest minds of their age could not name what touched them, only describe how it felt, does that mean they failed to understand it, or simply that they saw too much in it to give it only one name? The wind had passed. The rooftops were retiled. The servants returned to sweeping the courtyards. The court scholars moved on to matters of astronomy, irrigation, and courtly etiquette. The markets reopened. The birds returned to their nests. But beneath this seamless resumption of order, something had shifted. For Cordoba, a city that counted the stars, cataloged every leaf, and believed that the world's workings could be harmonized with human, will the silent spiral that rose and vanished in May of 976 remained a small but unyielding mystery. And in Al-Andalus, a mystery was not feared, but studied, recorded, and eventually absorbed, even if quietly. The philosophical afterlife of the spiral. The generation of scholars who witnessed the event, including Al-Murri, Fatima bint al-Hassan, and al-Qurtubi, did not live to see their theories accepted widely. By the early 11th century, the Caliphate of Cordoba was entering decline, fractured by civil war and the rise of competing Taifa kingdoms. Yet in the schools of Toledo, Seville, and Granada, where Islamic learning continued even under Christian reconquest, the idea of the spiral of air moving in secret patterns persisted. It entered medical writings as a metaphor for inner imbalance, architectural treatises in discussions of dome acoustics and airflow, mystical texts where the spiral became a symbol of divine unfolding. In the early 12th century, a scholar named Abu Marwan al-Karmani, writing in exile, referred to the 976 event in an unusual way. There was once a wind in the city of Cordoba that taught us more in its silence than the words of kings. Whether he witnessed it or simply inherited the story, his reflection shows that the memory survived not as history, but as wisdom literature, passed through teacher to student. Echoes in Europe. Strikingly, when Toledo's translation movement began in earnest in the 12th century, bringing Arabic science into Latin Europe, some of these ideas about atmospheric spirals made their way into Western manuscripts. One translated gloss on Aristotle's Meteorologica includes a note. The scholars of Cordoba did observe that air may turn in upon itself without thunder, and yet cause lifting and breaking. This might be a vague reference to 976, preserved not in annals but in footnotes, slipped between more respected lines. And so, like the wind itself, the memory moved quietly, laterally, touching other disciplines without announcing itself. The spiral as architectural principle. In the later Nasrid period, builders in Granada and Seville incorporated spiral-shaped wind channels into courtyard structures not just for cooling, but for harmonizing air. These spirals' muqarnas features, often thought to be decorative, may have served a practical function, inspired by earlier observations of wind movement. It's unlikely that builders in 1300 knew the details of the 976 Cordoba spiral, but the memory of air as dynamic, as architectural, as intelligent had already become part of design logic. Even today, traditional Andalusian homes include inner courtyards designed to coax air into circular motion, to cool without causing turbulence. And so the unknown wind, once seen as a disturbance, became part of everyday comfort. A lost book, a found fragment. In 1927, while cataloging fragments in the Escorial Library, a Spanish historian uncovered a folio labeled remnants of Cordoban letters, anonymous. Among prayer formulas and trade notes was a page titled, Sir Aldora, the Secret of the Spiral. The first line, in the year the caliph's garden bowed without storm, we learned that air is not to be commanded, but reed. The remainder of the text was damaged by fire. But this line alone suggests that Cordoba's scholars saw the wind not as a failing of science, but as a call to deeper attention. They did not explain the spiral. They entered into relationship with it. Fatima's final note. A copy of Fatima bint al-Hassan's Kitab al-Mawaja, Book of Currents, surfaced in Cairo in the 19th century, now lost again to time. But a passage was quoted in a student's commentary, which survives. If wind turns where there is no music, it is playing a note too low to hear. If animals step aside before it comes, they are listening to the score. She described the 976 wind not as an anomaly, but as a performance in an octave humans had forgotten how to perceive. Her work was never canonized, but in her words, we glimpse a world in which weather was a kind of language. One few could translate, but all were shaped by. Cordoba after the wind. By the turn of the 11th century, the caliphate would fracture. Libraries would burn. Scrolls would be lost. The court of scholars would disperse. And yet, in the preserved ruins of Cordoba's aqueduct stones, you can still trace the spiral-shaped water inlets. In the great mosque, air still moves softly through alternating arches, catching echoes that spin but do not stay. The spiral, it seems, remained, not as a memory, as a pattern. Final reflection, what the wind taught. The whirling wind of 976 did not topple towers or claim lives. Its violence was minimal. Its mystery was total. And that was enough. For Cordoba, a city defined by its knowledge, the spiral became a moment of humility, a reminder that there are forces too subtle to name, too swift to study, too balanced to fear, but also too real to ignore. And so we end with a thought. Is history made only by what we remember, or also by what we quietly build into our walls, our questions, and the spaces we leave open for air to turn? Story 6. Dust, Winds, and Death in the Steppes. Mongol Encounters, Mongolia, 1220. The Mongol Empire, forged by Temujin Genghis Khan, was not built with cities or stone. It was ridden into being, across rivers and deserts, by men who understood the moods of wind and earth better than they understood walls. In 1220, the Mongol horde had already begun its westward sweep, shaking empires and tribes alike from Central Asia to Persia. But while history remembers the sieges, slaughter, and strategy, there are whispers of something else, a quiet moment in the midst of that fury, when the sky turned in a way even the horsemen could not read. The source is fragmentary. The event is little known. But the wind that rose over the Orkhon Valley that spring seems to have halted even the Mongols for a moment. It was not a storm. It was a spiral of dust, narrow and sudden, and unlike any they had seen before. The Mongol way with the world. To the Mongols, nature was not symbolic. It was immediate. The steppe was calendar, clock, direction, and judgment. They tracked time by the feel of soil, knew weather by the color of horses' coats, and understood the presence of prey or predator by how grass bent against the wind. Shamans walked among them not as priests, but as interpreters of what could not be reasoned. And so, when something happened that even the oldest herders couldn't explain, it mattered. The event, Orkhon Valley, spring 1220. The Orkhon Valley, once the center of the old Uyghur and Tuareg Khaganates, had become a grazing ground and occasional way station for Mongol troops. A wide, rolling plain between river and mountain, it offered grass, water, and visibility, everything needed for a mobile army. According to the secret history of the Mongols, an anonymously authored 13th century epic chronicling the rise of Genghis Khan, there occurred a strange turning of the sky during a seasonal encampment. Though the event is mentioned only briefly, the passage is curious. The sky coiled down upon us like a rope, no lightning, no sound. The dust rose not from hoof or step but from breathless ground, horses scattered, shamans were silent. This cryptic passage, often skipped over by historians focused on military campaigns, suggests something unusual and possibly atmospheric. What would it take to frighten Mongol horses trained not to spook in battle and cause even shamans to fall silent? The nature of steppe winds. The Central Asian steppe is infamous for dust storms, driven by pressure changes, drought, and open terrain. But a dust storm is broad, loud, and horizontal. This description of a coiling descent, of dust lifting without cause, of an event isolated and vertical matches no known steppe storm pattern. Modern meteorologists have speculated that what was described may have been a dust devil, or landspout, a form of weak tornado, or rotating column of air that can form in arid climates with minimal cloud cover. In particularly unstable spring weather, with dry air rising rapidly from sun-baked earth, vortices can emerge suddenly, lifting dust high into the air without sound or warning. They are not large, but they are disturbing, because they seem to move with intention. Shamanic interpretation. In Mongol cosmology, the sky was not just a realm, it was a being. Tengri, the eternal blue sky, was God, judge, and witness. When the sky coiled downward, as the secret history says, it could be interpreted as Tengri manifesting displeasure. Shamans were trained to read signs in smoke, wind, and bone. Yet even they reportedly gave no reading of the event. One later commentary, written by a Buddhist monk who interviewed an elderly Mongol soldier decades after the campaigns, records this. When the air turned upon itself, the spirits stood up and walked away. Even the iron bow could not hold them. In other words, something so deeply out of balance had occurred that even spirit guides could not stay. The Khan's response. Genghis Khan was not known for sentiment, but he was deeply attuned to omens. According to a less-cited appendix to the secret history, compiled from oral reports in the late 13th century, the army paused for 3 days after the event, unusual for the highly mobile Mongol forces. There was no illness, no attack. Only an order: do not ride until the sky settles. In this pause, the warriors were instructed to leave tents unpitched so the sky would not feel covered, offer horse milk and tobacco to the air, an offering to clear invisible paths, burn juniper, a cleansing ritual used only when spirits were believed to be displaced. It is the only time in early Mongol records that movement halted without tactical or logistical reason. The oath under wind. 3 days later, when the wind had stilled, Genghis Khan reportedly made an oath to Tengri. It is recorded as follows. If I ride without understanding, may the wheel of heaven strike me as it did the earth. If I lead without harmony, may my bowstring snap and my horse stumble. This was not weakness. It was alignment, a recognition that power must be in sync with the world, or it would become curse instead of force. It's no coincidence that, after this event, the Khan's orders took on a sharper, more spiritual edge. His campaigns became not just conquest, but correction, a worldview in which those who defied order would be swept away. Like dust. And so we are left with a question. If even the fiercest army paused when the sky turned in silence, what does that say about the kinds of forces we still do not name? The dust spiral that disturbed the Mongol camp in the Orkhon Valley did not make it into the annals of empires. It wasn't recounted in Persian court poetry, or by Chinese scribes documenting the conquests of Genghis Khan. But it lived on in a whispered pause, a 3-day stillness, a break in the Mongol campaign's otherwise unrelenting advance. And it persisted, not through history as conquest often does, but through ritual behavior, and the way warriors watched the sky in the years that followed. This was no military encounter. It was a collision with something larger, something not even conquest could contain. The science in the soil. The Central Asian steppe is no stranger to wind. But to produce a rotational spiral strong enough to displace tents, scatter dust vertically, and terrify horses into bolting requires specific conditions. High solar heating of the ground. Cooler, dry air layers aloft. Flat, unobstructed terrain like the Orkhon Plain. Localized wind shear from thermal currents. These ingredients form dust devils spinning vortices common in deserts and dry valleys. But the description given in The Secret History suggests something more. The column of dust was sustained, not flickering. It created silence rather than the roar of a gust. It was said to coil downward, not rise from ground as a typical devil does. This leads some meteorologists to speculate it may have been a dry landspout or even a non-mesocyclonic tornado, spawned by extreme surface heating and an unstable lower atmosphere. In short, a naked spiral of air and dust, unaccompanied by clouds, thunder, or even storm signs. To a 21st century satellite, it might have gone unnoticed. But to the Mongols, it was an event of total attention. The shaman's burden. Mongol shamans or bar were not simply religious figures. They were readers of the world, responsible for interpreting weather, animal behavior, dreams, and sudden anomalies. They did not predict the future. They translated imbalance. And when this spiral rose over the valley, the shamans' silence was more significant than any prophecy. According to an oral tradition recorded in the 14th century by a Buddhist monk in the Erdenian Tabchai, a Mongolian chronicle, the sky turned and the shamans took off their furs. They stood bare to see if Tengri would strike. Removing furs was not symbolic humility. It was an invitation to clarity, a way to say, "We hide nothing now, we are listening." It was also an acknowledgement of powerlessness. For if even the sky could turn on itself, then all meanings were briefly suspended. Changes in the campaign. Though the Mongol campaign westward continued, scholars note a slight shift in Genghis Khan's leadership style after 1220. Whether coincidence or causation, several historians and anthropologists have drawn connections between the spiral event and increased reliance on ritual sacrifices before major movements, greater emphasis on reading signs in wind and terrain, the formal elevation of Tengri worship in Mongol royal culture. In the Altan Tabchai, Golden Summary, a 17th century history compiling earlier oral traditions, we find this passage attributed to Genghis Khan after a later omen. The earth speaks with hoofbeats, the sky speaks without sound, I fear only the latter. It is possible that the 1220 wind spiral, while minor in damage, marked a shift in cosmological vigilance from environmental dominance to environmental negotiation. Echoes in Mongol ritual. For generations after Genghis Khan, Mongol rituals in open country began to include a practice known as Salkian Turururk, the circling of the wind. It involved leading horses in slow circles before departure, chanting verses invoking Tengri's balance, offering burnt juniper or fermented mare's milk to the four corners. The ritual was not always explained. Some sources say it commemorated a forgotten wind. Others claim it was simply tradition. But Salkian Turururk was first recorded in 1221, the year after the Orkhon spiral. The silence of the shamans had become a practice. A scholar's speculation. In 1963, a Soviet ethnographer named Nikolai Amersky, working with Mongol herders in Arkhangai province, documented a local taboo about the turning breath. According to his notes, if the air turns in daylight and does not chase the clouds, do not ride. That is the steppe trying to speak. He traced the taboo to an old story about a time when the Khan waited 3 days for the sky to forget what it had seen. Amersky, a rationalist, dismissed the tale as folk invention. But later in life, He wrote privately that this story carries a tone of remembered truth. What is remembered without explanation? The spiral of 1220 was not marked on any map. It was not named. It did not become a legend of war or glory. But it lived in the pause of a great campaign, the silence of those tasked with explanation, the rituals that emerged in its wake, and perhaps more importantly, it lived in the watchfulness it inspired. From that year forward, Mongol scouts were instructed to report not just terrain and troop movements, but air behavior, animal unease, sudden silence in weather. It was not fear. It was attention. And so we are left with a question. When a people who live by the land fall silent before it, is it because they are afraid or because they understand something we no longer do? The Mongol Empire surged outward after 1220 through Bukhara, into Samarkand, beyond the Caspian and deep into Persia. Cities fell, borders blurred, maps expanded. But no chronicler ever again recorded a halt like the one in the Orkhan Valley, when a spiral of air stilled an army, baffled its holy men, and left no ruin behind, only memory, embedded in the cultural fabric of a people who rarely paused for anything. That moment, that pause, would shape ritual, leadership, and even the way Mongols thought about the sky. In this final section, we reflect on what that spiral meant not just meteorologically or mystically, but historically as a model for how empires and individuals alike reckon with the unaccountable. Genghis Khan after the spiral. Temujin Genghis Khan is remembered for his ruthlessness and strategic genius. Yet he was also deeply spiritual, concerned not just with dominance but with cosmic alignment. He believed his victories were sanctioned by Tengri, the eternal blue sky, and that failure would only come if he broke from harmony with the natural and spiritual order. After the 1220 incident, his decrees became markedly more explicit in spiritual framing. Campaigns began with formal invocations to Tengri. Punishments for defiling sacred sites or ignoring omens grew more severe. He reportedly established a sky day, once per lunar year, where his court would refrain from judgment, warfare, or trade. These changes reflect a shift from conquest, as entitlement to conquest, as conditional granted by forces, beyond steel and strategy. In this way, the wind may have reshaped the soul of the empire, even as it left no mark on paper. Cultural inheritance, the spiral in the steppe mind. Over generations, the Mongol peoples began to embed the concept of spiraling wind into expressions and customs. Children who acted erratically were said to be touched by the sky's circle. If a horse went missing during calm weather, elders would say, "The wind must have turned its ears." Circular dances were performed around yurts at seasonal changes, not just for celebration, but to balance invisible forces. These customs spread beyond Mongolia into Kazakh, Tuvan, and Kyrgyz traditions. While modern anthropologists often chalk them up to symbolic aesthetics, there is evidence that they stem from an ancient recollection of one vivid, wordless lesson. Ritual persistence, the circle walk. One practice that continued well into the 19th century was the circle walk, performed by herders after unusually still days on the steppe. They would walk 3 times around their yurt before sleep. Leave a strip of dried meat tied to the door flap in case the wandering heir returned. Ask no questions and speak no predictions until the next dawn. To outsiders, it seemed quaint. To herders, it was simply what you did when the heir had turned once before. The spiral in Mongol symbolism. The Ulzi symbol, an ancient Mongolian motif resembling an endless knot or spiral, predates Genghis Khan but gained renewed popularity in the 13th century. While scholars debate its origins, some suggest that the symbol representing infinity, balance, and interconnection was increasingly used after the empire's great expansion began. Could it be that the spiral of wind, experienced during that pivotal early campaign, helped revive or reinforce this symbol's meaning? Perhaps. For the Mongols, the spiral came to mean not chaos but reminder that everything is connected and even wind may serve as teacher. The writings that remained silent. There are no detailed accounts of the Orkhon spiral in foreign sources. No Persian court mentioned it. No Chinese envoy recorded it. No European missionary ever heard of it. But this is exactly the point. It was not a public event. It left no conquest. It wrote no treaties. It won no city. Its legacy lived only in behavior, belief, and the intangible shift in the way the Mongols watched the horizon. When the sky turned once, they never looked at it the same way again. Final note from the steppe. In 1934, a Soviet ethnographer visiting herders near Lake Kovskoe recorded an elder saying, "Before you build a fire, watch the dust. If it spins without reason, wait. Not all air wants you here today." He called it superstition, but he wrote it down anyway. That elder, likely descended from generations of herders, was not quoting any book. He was channeling a history unrecorded but not forgotten. Final reflection, power in pause. The Mongols conquered half the known world, yet they paused for a wind they could not name. This, perhaps, is the most profound truth of all. True power is not in force alone. It is in knowing when to move and when to wait, when to fight and when to listen. And sometimes, it is in understanding that a spiral in the air can carry more weight than an enemy on horseback. And so we end with a thought. If an empire built on movement stopped for the sky, how often might we, too, need to pause not for answers, but to feel the invisible things turning around us? Story 7. Storm over Avignon. Papal interpretations of wind-borne wrath, France, 1362. In the 14th century, Europe was still trembling from the Black Death. Entire villages had vanished. Fields stood fallow. Faith was shaken and authority even more so. The church, long seen as an unshakable foundation, now found itself adrift in doubt. It was during this uncertain time, in the city of Avignon, that the papacy witnessed a storm it could neither predict nor explain. The year was 1362. The sky over southern France turned dark without warning. Winds descended not in a gale, but in a sudden whirling collapse. Stonework trembled, roofs lifted, dust rose in spirals from the cloisters. And for a church already struggling to interpret plague and pestilence, this wind posed yet another unanswerable question. Was this mere weather? Or was it judgment? Avignon, the papal city in exile. From 1309 to 1376, the papacy resided in Avignon, rather than Rome. This period, often called the Avignon papacy, was marked by tension, political maneuvering, and a sense of spiritual unease. 7 popes ruled from this city on the Rhone, surrounded by thick walls and quiet dread. By 1362, the new Pope Urban V had recently assumed the throne. A former Benedictine monk, Urban was considered austere, reform-minded, and wary of indulgence. But he inherited a city brimming with contradiction. Lavish palaces next to starving peasants. Bureaucratic power alongside failing public health. A growing sense that divine favor had shifted elsewhere. So when the wind came, it was not just a meteorological event, it was a confrontation. The day of the spiral. Accounts from the Vatican archives describe a sudden and localized spiral wind that struck the city shortly after Mass on a spring afternoon in 1362. The bell tower of a minor abbey cracked at the base. Herb gardens were stripped bare in seconds. Monks reported dizziness and nausea, despite no visible sickness. The Rhone's surface was drawn upward, forming a column of water mist that hovered for moments before vanishing. One scribe noted, "The air itself recoiled. We stood under heaven's breath and could neither move nor pray." The storm did not spread to the countryside. Only the papal quarter, the monastic houses, and a few nearby streets were affected. To some, this was proof the wrath was not general, but targeted. Interpreting the whirlwind, divine judgment. Within days, sermons across Avignon turned from general lament to specific warnings. That corruption within the church had angered heaven. That the luxury of the cardinals invited punishment. That the spiral was a pre-plague cleansing a warning sign, not a final strike. Urban V convened a theological council to interpret the wind. Among the attendees, Petrus Agrafeuil, a scholar of Augustinian doctrine; Jacques de Mornaz, an early student of natural philosophy; Sister Anne of Arles, whose visions during the plague had gained her renown; several unnamed Dominican inquisitors, curious if heresy had summoned the wind. The debate lasted 3 days. Natural or supernatural? Jacques de Mornaz presented an early attempt to describe the wind in naturalistic terms, invoking Aristotelian thought. If heat is drawn from earth faster than it can rise, it will coil. The wind seeks balance, not punishment. He was ridiculed. Sister Anne, who had lived through the great mortality, claimed the wind was a ghost of disease, come back to ask why we had learned nothing. Others wondered aloud if the devil, not God, had sent the spiral. The final verdict, recorded in a parchment now preserved in the archives départementales de Vaucluse, read, "The wind was from God. What it meant we are unfit to know." The aftermath. Urban V ordered a week of silence in the monasteries. No chimes, no chants. He walked barefoot through the damaged gardens. He reportedly told an aide, "We build walls to protect the soul, but the air goes where it wishes." He did not mention the wind again. But he did begin, quietly, to prepare for his return to Rome. Whether it was political pressure or a spiritual reckoning is uncertain. What is known, 3 years after the spiral, he became the first Avignon pope to attempt to reclaim the Roman seat. And so we are left with a question. If the wind singled out a holy city, not to destroy it but to unsettle it, was it divine wrath or a test of how we respond when the veil of certainty is lifted? When the spiral wind receded, Avignon's silence deepened. The cloisters resumed their chanting. The bells rang once more. Markets reopened. But under the arches of the papal city, something had shifted. The wind had not caused widespread death. No fires had erupted. No flood had followed. Yet it left behind a more profound damage. Uncertainty. For a church that claimed divine guidance in all things, the inability to explain the spiral with clarity or unity left cracks far deeper than any fractured abbey stone. The Council of Air, Theology Meets Atmosphere. Shortly after the event, Pope Urban V quietly commissioned a discreet theological inquiry, not into miracles or saints, but into air, movement, and why wind might act with intention. The records of this council survive in part in the Liber Ventorum, the Book of Winds, held in the archives of the Avignon Cathedral. Its contributors included Master Hugo de Lurac, a Dominican familiar with Arabic translations of Aristotle and Galen; Brother Lambert of Siena, who had studied the optics of halos and rainbows; Magister Aldrich, a physician who believed illness was caused by miasmata or bad air; an anonymous scribe who appears to have cross-referenced accounts from both monastics and laypeople. Their task: to determine if the spiral wind could be categorized and, if possible, contained in doctrine. Descriptions collected. In their report, the council gathered testimonies including a nun who said she saw pages lifted from her prayer book, rising and spinning before falling open at the Book of Lamentations; a stable boy who reported horses crying out without cause, and a silence that fell so hard you could feel it pressing on your chest. A clerk who described a smell of stone dust, though no stones had broken nearby. A foreign merchant who claimed the air shivered, though no chill followed. These experiences could not be reduced to one account, nor could they be harmonized by doctrine. In one especially telling note, Hugo de Lurac writes, "We know the wind blows where it wills, but do we know when it listens?" Between natural and supernatural, the debate was split. Magister Aldrich, following humoral theory, argued that the spiral was an imbalance in the Earth's exhalations, perhaps worsened by unburied plague dead beneath Avignon. Brother Lambert cautioned against attributing to the air what belonged to the will of God, warning that obsession with weather led toward the vanity of sorcery. Master Hugo, however, introduced an idea rare for the time, that natural phenomena could be divine without being punitive. He argued, God need not always speak in thunder. He may whisper in the turn of leaves or the breath that makes no sound. That he does so near his church is not punishment, but perhaps a reminder. This suggestion, neither damning nor excusing the church, offered a way forward. Urban V's quiet reform. Though the findings were never published, Urban V acted. Within months of the inquiry, lavish feasts within the papal palace were curtailed. The wearing of gem-studded vestments was restricted to major feast days. Urban required each cardinal to spend 1 week per month in public charity, distributing food to the poor. When asked if this was repentance, he simply said, "We do not repent wind, but we walk straighter after it." Echoes beyond Avignon. Elsewhere in Europe, word of the spiral reached other cities in distorted forms. In Florence, it was said that the Pope had been lifted from his seat and dropped again by the hand of God. In York, it was rumored the wind had carried away the Pope's voice, silencing him for a day. This is untrue. In Bohemia, preachers invoked the spiral as proof that the church's center had shifted, a precursor to the coming challenges of the Hussite movement. The wind's legacy was not just meteorological. It became a moment of muttered sermons, private reflections, and pre-Reformation murmurs. Avignon watches the air. For years after 1362, records from the papal libraries show increased note-taking on weather. How the wind moved around the towers, where the birds did not fly, what the air smelled like before Mass. Monks recorded air pressure without tools, noting how heavy their heads felt, or how long candles flickered before dying. This was not superstition. It was watchfulness, born from a single moment where the wind did something no one expected and everyone remembered. And so we are left with a question. When faith fails to explain the air that moves around us, do we adjust our theology or simply look up more often, wondering when it will return? The spiral wind that fell upon Avignon in 1362 did not return, but its memory embedded itself quietly, awkwardly, stubbornly into the architecture of the church's imagination. By the end of that century, the Avignon papacy was over. The seat of power returned to Rome. But within the cloisters, in theological margins, and beneath the frescoes of newly built chapels, the spiral lingered. It was never canonized, never declared a miracle, and never again mentioned in an official papal encyclical. But it changed behavior, not through decree, through hesitation. A church that listened differently. In the years after the wind, sermons in Avignon increasingly focused on discernment, the ability to tell false signs from true ones, noise from meaning. Monastic instruction began to include readings from natural philosophers, not to undermine theology, but to better understand God's methods through creation. Quiet reflection became a favored spiritual discipline, displacing more ecstatic forms of prayer in some orders. It was as though the wind had taught the church to lower its voice, if only for a while. Even Pope Urban V, never known for rhetorical flourish, began using more conditional language in his letters. Rather than proclaiming, "Thus says the Lord," he would write, "Let us consider that God may be speaking through our surroundings, even when words fail." Architecture after the wind. One curious legacy is architectural. In 1370, renovations to the palace of the popes added a series of small, high-level vents in certain upper halls designed not for practical air circulation, but to allow movement of air spirits, as one document puts it. More practically, the additions were justified as aesthetic openings for natural light. But their alignment, spiral-patterned, narrow, vertical, mimicked the supposed descent of the 1362 wind. Were the builders commemorating the event, or simply trying not to trap it again? No record says. But the shapes remain. Theology reconsidered, a new category of event. In 1374, a Dominican named Friar Nicolas de Lunel wrote a short treatise called De Occulta Motion Caeli, on the hidden motion of the heavens. In it, he proposed the idea of intermediary disturbances, events that were not miracles, nor punishments, nor natural per se, but motions of reminder. He listed the spiral at Avignon, a silent tremor in Toulouse, 1366, the spontaneous leaning of a tower cross in Marseille, 1371. These he grouped under what he called whispers of the divine. His work was quietly shelved, but a copy was made, and one of its readers, it seems, was a young German cleric named Jan Hus, who would later speak often of God's voice not always thundering, but sometimes swaying the reed. Echoes in Reformation thought. It's difficult to trace the spiral wind's influence directly into the theological revolutions that would follow. But what is clear is that Avignon's moment of uncertainty seeded an idea that signs do not always confirm. Sometimes they question, and that God, if present in the storm, may also be present in the confusion it leaves behind. By the 15th century, proto-reformers began asking not whether the church was correct, but whether it was still listening. The wind had not answered their questions. It had interrupted them. The final archive entry, the last known official Vatican document referencing the 1362 wind, is an anonymous annotation in the margin of a 1377 inventory. Remove the cracked bell of St. Andrew's. It was ever troubled after the turning air. No context, no further explanation. But the bell, like the spiral, was considered permanently altered. And that alteration required removal, not repair. The spiral as absence. Modern historians rarely mention the 1362 wind. There are no monuments, no feast days, no saints linked to it. It passed like so many forgotten storms. And yet, in the care with which church ritual evolved afterward, in the humility of post-Avignon papal language, in the long silences of council minutes following inexplicable events, we see its shadow. It did not destroy. It disoriented. And that, for an institution built on certainty, was perhaps the greater force. Final reflection, a lesson unfixed. The spiral did not offer a message. It offered a gap, a place where certainty failed and all re-entered. In an age of plague, excess, and control, the wind reminded even the highest holy men that not all turning is deviation. Some is recalibration. And sometimes that recalibration comes not through canon or creed, but through the sound of nothing rising in a sacred courtyard, just when prayers seemed most sure. And so we end with a thought. What happens when the church meant to interpret all things is met with a silence it cannot name, and how long can such a silence echo? Story 8. The Whirlwind and the Workshop, Leonardo's Notes on Rotating Air, Italy, 1508. In the early 1500s, Leonardo da Vinci was a man no longer bound by patronage or courtly expectations. At nearly 60 years old, he had become what few could afford to be in Renaissance Italy. A private thinker, unhurried by deadlines, free to explore obsessions that would never be painted or sculpted. Among his many fascinations, muscle movement, optics, hydraulics, there was one recurring curiosity that appeared again and again in his notes. Air that moves in a spiral. In pages largely ignored by art historians, buried between sketches of water flow and war machines, Leonardo recorded meticulous observations of vortices, eddies, and columnar winds. To him, these weren't just curiosities. They were keys to understanding how the world breathes. Leonardo and the language of motion. Leonardo's notebooks, famously written in mirror script, are full of verbs: flow, bend, rise, collapse, twist. To him, motion was the grammar of nature, and wind, especially wind that spun, was a dialect he had not yet learned. By 1508, living in Milan once more and no longer tethered to court commissions, Leonardo had time to pursue his investigations quietly. He had already filled thousands of pages with anatomical studies, mechanical diagrams, and hydraulic experiments. But in his Codex Leicester and Codex Atlanticus, one finds increasingly detailed sketches of air in motion. These were not theoretical spirals. They were grounded in observation. The way dust danced in a barn shaft. How candle smoke curled against the ceiling. How falling water twisted pockets of air beneath it. In one note he wrote, "The wind does not know its spirals, but it must, for it leaves spiral marks." The vortex's pattern. Leonardo's scientific vision often hinged on pattern recognition. He believed that water and air obeyed similar rules. The spiral was a universal motion. Vortices revealed where energy hid itself. He was likely the first in Western history to suggest that a tornado, a draining basin, and a galaxy might share not cause but form. In one famous drawing he compared a man's flowing hair in wind, the curl of a river eddy, a smoke column twisting in a room. He wrote, "Nature is fond of the curve. The straight line is man's fantasy." These weren't metaphors. They were early fluid dynamics, before such a science existed. 1508, a year of particular winds. Letters from Leonardo's assistants suggest that in 1508, the Lombardy region experienced unusual atmospheric behavior, dry spells followed by sudden, violent windstorms. Some of these included rotating gusts, which tore tiles from rooftops and frightened farm animals. Leonardo, rather than retreat indoors, reportedly stood out in the fields, watching. He sketched spirals in dust, noted how they moved against prevailing winds, and measured their entry and exit points in open courtyards. In one scribbled margin he wrote, "The spiral comes not from above, nor below, but from the desire of air to move in more than one direction." While others feared these whirlwinds as signs of divine displeasure, or dismissed them as whether Leonardo asked, "What is the spiral trying to solve?" The mechanics of the invisible. Without barometers, anemometers, or satellite data, Leonardo devised physical proxies to study invisible forces. He hung paper ribbons from beams to track interior airflow. He dropped ashes and fine powder to trace turbulence. He observed bird flight, noting how wings adjusted instinctively to updrafts. In a series of diagrams now held in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana, he mapped concentric circles of air movement, labeling parts of the vortex: entrata, quor, ritorno, entry, heart, return. Centuries before modern physics, he intuitively sensed that spirals were not chaotic, that vortices conserved motion, that the eye of a spiral might be the place of least resistance, not greatest violence. The spiral as a form of memory. In one of his more speculative notes, Leonardo wrote, "The spiral remembers. When disturbed, it reforms. The line it draws is the line it will draw again." Here, he wasn't just describing wind. He was exploring the idea that nature repeats itself, and that understanding such repetitions, no matter how subtle, might offer access to nature's design language. To Leonardo, the whirlwind was not anomaly. It was expression, an act of natural self-articulation. Notebooks over paintings. By this point in his life, Leonardo painted rarely. He found greater satisfaction in notebooks than canvases. Where color failed, ink captured nuance. Where faces faded, spirals remained. And so, when others feared whirlwinds, he treated them as tutors. He would walk through dusty alleys, pausing to observe the lift of grit. He stared into candle smoke not for warmth, but for lesson. And he saw, in the turning air, not disorder but design without signature. And so we are left with a question. If a spiral of wind can teach without speaking, what else might we learn from things that vanish the moment we try to measure them? In the second half of 1508, Leonardo da Vinci grew increasingly absorbed by spirals not as decoration, but as phenomena. His workshop assistants found him muttering about coiled air, abandoning commissions, and focusing instead on experiments few understood. He didn't write poetry about the wind. He didn't claim it as divine. He simply asked, "What does the spiral want?" Building the invisible. Leonardo had always seen the world as machine and mystery. In his notes from this period, he constructed numerous hypothetical devices intended not to create spirals, but to trace them. A rotating armature with threads dipped in ink, meant to be moved by passing wind. A large dome structure with open vents, meant to trap air currents in a controlled space. A thin wheel with feathers balanced vertically, designed to tilt when touched by swirling air. None of these were built, but their design shows intent. To build around what cannot be seen and thus invite its movement. This was more than curiosity. It was early systems thinking, an effort to model behavior through indirect influence. Observation turned philosophy. In the Codex Arundel, Leonardo writes, "That which is strong moves forward, but that which is enduring turns." This sentence, nestled between drawings of hair strands and eddies in water, is often interpreted metaphorically. But for Leonardo, spiraling motion wasn't softness, it was resilience. He noticed that in air, as in water, direct paths break, curved paths adapt. The spiral allows both persistence and transformation. He even speculated that human muscles worked in spiraling contraction, not linear pull, a concept verified centuries later. Nature's preference for spirals. By now, Leonardo had begun knotting spirals everywhere. The way vine tendrils wrapped as they grew. The furl of snails and shells. The double helix pattern suggested in seed heads and pine cones. The structure of turbulent streams as they split around stones. He believed spirals were not decorative, but efficient. "The spiral is how nature stores force in small space," he wrote, observing a coiled spring. In the whirlwind, Leonardo saw a compressed lesson, a brief, animated display of how force could hide inside form. The spiral as memory device. Perhaps most intriguingly, Leonardo began to theorize that vortices could be used to store or transmit motion, a radical idea for the early 16th century. His notes hint at wind spiral used to drive mechanical devices, water spirals used to redirect force across planes, even air spirals as a model for organizing knowledge. One cryptic phrase reads, "The mind turns as the air turns. Memory is held not in chambers, but in motion repeated." While these writings never developed into complete theories, They echo ideas now found in computational models, fluid memory, and even data organization metaphors. Leonardo's emotional spiral. Though scientific in tone, some of Leonardo's notes betray a personal element. One reads, "When I am near the spiral, I am near the place where the world speaks to itself." And another, more melancholy, "It moves and I cannot follow. I draw and it is gone." These sentences written without context suggest that, for Leonardo, the spiral represented not only understanding, but its elusiveness. He was chasing a principle of the universe that refused to be still. This was not frustration, it was reverence. The spiral in the sky. In the winter of 1508-1509, Leonardo turned his gaze upward. One sketch from that season shows a model of planetary orbits arranged not in circles, but spirals expanding outward, a concept long before Kepler's laws or Newton's gravitation. In his notes he asks, "If the heavens are turning, are they also spiraling? Is time itself a vortex?" No one answered him. But the question remains profound. The spiral as an enduring form. Though Leonardo never painted a whirlwind, spirals appear in his compositions subtly. The curved cascade in the Virgin and Child with St. Anne. The flow of hair and drapery in the Leda drawings. Even in the Last Supper, where the positioning of hands and eyes suggests motion that curls inward and outward, like a spoken idea returning to its source. These were not accidents. They were hidden homages to a form he could not name, but always recognized. And so we are left with a question. If one of history's greatest minds devoted his final energies to understanding the spiral, not to explain it fully, but to chase it, what might we gain by watching it turn, without demanding it speak? By 1510, Leonardo da Vinci was an old man by the standards of his day. He had no heir, no formal school, and no final project to unify his life's work. What he had instead were notebooks, thousands of pages inked with spirals, curls, currents, and coils. He had followed the spiral from dust to water, from hair to birds, and even into the heavens. But now, as his hands stiffened and commissions faded, he seemed to let the spiral go, not because it had been solved, but because he had learned how to let it remain unsolved. This was not abandonment. It was maturity. A theory without a name. Leonardo never gave his spiral theory a formal title. It had no Latin treatise, no public demonstration, no formal disciples. Instead, it lived in the margins, scattered among anatomical diagrams, caught between engineering sketches, woven through landscape studies. One page might show the human spine next to a whirlpool. Another might pair wind-blown sand with the twist of tree bark. This wasn't disorder, it was integration. For Leonardo, the spiral was not a category of knowledge. It was a way of noticing, a model of how things change, not just what they are. The final spiral drawing. Among the last known spiral-focused pages is a small, loosely inked sketch tucked into the back of the Codex Atlanticus. It depicts a spiral column of water rising from a shallow pool, small arrows tracing reverse eddies, a faint outline of a human figure leaning over it, watching. No text, just motion, a final observation, a final acknowledgement, not of discovery, but of endless recurrence, forgotten then rediscovered. For centuries after Leonardo's death in 1519, his spiral studies lay unnoticed. The art world prized his unfinished paintings. Engineers focused on his military machines. Anatomists mined his drawings of muscle and bone. But the pages on air and vortices, dismissed as sketches of whimsical weather. Only in the 20th century, when fluid mechanics became a science, and turbulence a subject of serious inquiry, did physicists and mathematicians rediscover Leonardo's spiral pages with new respect. They were not precise enough to be predictive, but they were conceptually years ahead. Today, some aerospace engineers cite his observations as proto-turbulence theory. The spiral as scientific legacy. Leonardo never wrote equations. He lacked the mathematical tools of later centuries. But he understood that spirals hold memory, and that turbulence is not chaos, but complex recurrence. He sensed intuitively that vortices carry momentum. Energy in nature prefers to distribute through spiraling flows. Systems under stress do not break, they bend, curl, and adapt. These are principles now taught in modern fluid dynamics, weather modeling, and even ecological systems theory. He didn't need equations to grasp them. He needed only time, silence, and curiosity. Spirals in the human mind. In his final years, Leonardo's interests turned inward. He reflected not just on nature's spirals, but on thought itself as a spiral process. The mind does not move in straight line, it circles, it returns, it turns upon that which it left behind. He saw memory, learning, and even emotion as vortical, not linear accumulations, but looping processes of deepening understanding. In this, too, he was ahead of his time. Modern psychology increasingly models cognition not as simple storage, but as recursive patterns, much like the spiral flows he traced in smoke and water. The spiral and mortality. Perhaps Leonardo's most profound reflection came late in life. Death is not an end. It is the return of force to motion, of motion to rest, of rest to shape again. To him, the spiral offered a model for life and death, a reminder that endings often become beginnings turned sideways. As breath curls into the air, so too does the self dissolve not into nothing, but into another cycle. Final echo, what the spiral taught. Leonardo da Vinci died in 1519, far from Florence, in the quiet chambers of Château du Clos Lucé in France. He left no grand summary of his spiral studies. No final theorem. Only the pages scattered, dense, beautiful. And yet, his work with the spiral left us something rarer than a solved problem. A practice of paying attention to things we cannot hold. A humility before forces that shape us without warning. A curiosity that remains valid even when no answer comes. And so we end with a thought. If Leonardo spent his final years chasing the spiral not to master it, but to follow it, what does it say about the value of questions that turn, and turn again, without ever arriving?